If you're enjoying this video, smash that like button, subscribe, and hit the bell. Share it with your friends, and let me know in the comments where you're watching from. Every like and subscribe helps the channel grow. My name is Diane Mercer, and I'm a park ranger stationed in the rugged wilderness of Colorado. It's been 2 years since I left the chaos of city life behind, trading in my badge as a police officer for the peace and quiet of the mountains. Most mornings, I wake up before dawn, lace up my boots, and head out on patrol. It's my favorite part of the day. Just me, the crisp mountain air, and the endless views of pine-covered peaks. This morning started like any other. The sun was just beginning to rise, casting golden light over Devil's Peak. The old mining region is off limits to visitors, but that doesn't stop people from sneaking in. As I made my way along a narrow trail, I spotted a group of teenagers near one of the abandoned mine entrances. I called out, my voice echoing through the valley. This area's restricted. The kids froze like deer caught in headlights. They were just messing around, probably trying to scare each other with ghost stories about the old mines. I gave them a warning and sent them on their way, but something about their nervous glances stuck with me. After they left, I walked over to check the mine entrance. The wooden barriers we'd put up were splintered and broken, like someone or something had forced their way inside. Fresh scratches marked the rock around the opening, but they didn't look like claw marks from an animal. They were strange, almost like symbols carved into the stone. I stood there for a moment, staring into the darkness of the mine shaft. A cold breeze drifted out, carrying with it a faint sound like whispers just out of reach. Shaking it off as my imagination, I made a note to report the damage later and continued my patrol. The rest of the morning was uneventful, but I couldn't shake the feeling that something was off. The mountain seemed different today. Even the rock formations near some of the other mine entrances looked unusual, like they had shifted overnight into unnatural shapes. I told myself it was just erosion, or maybe a trick of the light, but deep down I felt uneasy. Something about Devil's Peak didn't feel right anymore. I'll be honest, being out here in the mountains is my way of running from the past. 2 years ago, I was a police officer in Denver. I loved the job at first, but everything changed after a shooting that went horribly wrong. It was supposed to be a routine call, just chasing a suspect into an underground tunnel system. But things went south fast. Shots were fired, and when it was over, someone innocent got hurt. I still hear it sometimes. The echoes of gunfire in those tight, suffocating tunnels, the walls closing in around me. That was the day I realized I couldn't do it anymore. I couldn't stay in the city, couldn't face those dark spaces again. So, I packed up my life and came here, to the wide open wilderness where I could breathe again. But even out here, it hasn't been easy. The other rangers are mostly good guys, but let's just say they don't make it easy for a woman to prove herself in this job, especially one with baggage like mine. They think I'm too soft because I used to be a city cop. They don't get why I avoid caves or tight spaces whenever I can. The only person who seems to understand is Lewis, our helicopter pilot. He's been flying these mountains for years and knows them like the back of his hand. He doesn't pry into my past or judge me for my fears. He just gets it that sometimes you need space to heal. But lately, even the open spaces haven't felt safe. Last night, I had another nightmare about being trapped underground. It's always the same. I'm crawling through a dark tunnel, and I can hear voices calling my name. But when I turn around, there's no one there, just endless darkness. Maybe that's why I've been so obsessed with the mining history around Devil's Peak. There's something about those old stories that keeps pulling me in. Like the 1907 collapse that killed 32 miners but left 2 bodies unaccounted for. What happened to them? Did they escape? Or were they buried alive somewhere deep underground? I've been collecting old articles and journals about it, trying to piece together what really happened. Some of the miners' families claimed they heard strange noises coming from the mountain for weeks after the collapse, like muffled cries for help or rocks shifting on their own. It sounds crazy, right? Just old ghost stories people tell to scare each other. But standing there this morning by that broken mine entrance, staring into the darkness, it didn't feel like just a story anymore. The call came in just after lunch. A professional climbing team had gone missing near Devil's Peak. They were supposed to check in with their base camp the night before but never did. Their last known location was somewhere near one of the old mine ventilation shafts. I grabbed my gear and met up with the local search and rescue team at the trailhead. I'd worked with them before and they were good people, calm under pressure, thorough and experienced in these mountains, but even they seemed uneasy about this one. We started the search near the climbers' last GPS ping. It didn't take long to find their equipment. A pile of high-end climbing gear abandoned near a steep rock face. The ropes were still anchored in place, but there was no sign of the climbers themselves. "What do you think happened?" one of the rescuers asked as we examined the scene. I didn't have an answer. Climbers don't just leave their gear behind unless something goes very wrong. But what struck me as odd were the markings on the rock face. At first, I thought they were chalk marks, something climbers use to plan their routes, but they didn't look like any climbing notation I'd ever seen. They were jagged and uneven, almost like scratches or symbols carved into the stone. The search dogs didn't make things any easier. Normally, these dogs are fearless, but today they refused to go anywhere near the mine shaft nearby. One of them started whining and pulling at its leash like it was desperate to get away. "Maybe there's a bear or something down there," someone suggested. But even as they said it, I could tell they didn't believe it. We decided to split up and keep searching the area around the shaft. As I moved further down the trail, I couldn't shake the feeling that we weren't alone out here. The forest was unusually quiet. No bird song, no rustling leaves, just an eerie stillness that made my skin crawl. Then I heard it, a faint sound coming from somewhere ahead. At first, I thought it was just the wind moving through the trees, but as I got closer, it started to sound more like voices. "Hello?" I called out, hoping it might be one of the missing climbers. But there was no response, just that same low murmur, like someone whispering just out of earshot. I followed the sound until I reached another mine entrance. This one partially collapsed and overgrown with moss and weeds. The whispering stopped as soon as I got close, leaving only silence behind. I stood there for a moment, staring into the darkness of the mine and feeling that same cold breeze from earlier brush against my face. Something about this place felt wrong, like it was watching me somehow. I backed away slowly and radioed back to the team about what I'd found. We agreed to regroup and decide our next steps together, but as I headed back toward the others, I couldn't shake the feeling that we were being watched and not by anything human. The decision to go into the mine wasn't an easy one. None of us wanted to, but with no sign of the climbers on the surface, we didn't have much of a choice. We needed someone with experience underground, so we called in Hammond, a cave rescue specialist who'd worked these mountains for years. Hammond arrived just before sunset, carrying enough gear to outfit a small expedition. He was calm and confident, the kind of guy who'd seen it all and didn't scare easily. I envied that about him. "Ready to head in?" he asked, handing me a spare headlamp. I hesitated for a moment, my stomach twisting into knots. The thought of going underground again brought back flashes of that day in Denver, the darkness, the gunshots, the walls closing in around me. But I couldn't let my fear stop me. Not now. "Yeah," I said, forcing myself to sound braver than I felt. "Let's do it." The entrance to the mine was narrow and jagged, like the mountain had swallowed it whole and was trying to keep it hidden. As we stepped inside, the temperature dropped sharply, and the air grew damp and heavy. Our headlamps cut through the darkness, casting long shadows on the uneven walls. The deeper we went, the stranger things became. The old mining maps we'd brought didn't match up with what we were seeing. Tunnels that were supposed to be sealed off were wide open, while others seemed to twist and turn in ways that didn't make sense. "Looks like someone's been digging," Hammond said, running his hand along a freshly cut section of rock. But who would bother with these old tunnels? I didn't have an answer. All I knew was that the deeper we went, the more uneasy I felt. The walls seemed to press closer together, and the faint sound of dripping water echoed like footsteps behind us. Then we found something that made my blood run cold. A piece of climbing equipment wedged into a crack in the rock. It was brand new, just like the gear we'd found outside earlier. But there was no sign of its owner, no footprints, no scuff marks on the floor. nothing to explain how it had gotten there. As we moved further in, strange sounds began to fill the tunnels, soft whispers that seemed to come from nowhere and everywhere at once. At first I thought it was just the wind moving through cracks in the rock, but then I heard something that stopped me in my tracks. My name, Diane. It was faint and distant, but unmistakable. Someone or something was calling me from deeper inside the mine. "Did you hear that?" I whispered to Hammond. "Hear what?" he asked, shining his light around nervously. Before I could answer, there was a loud rumble behind us. A deep, bone-shaking sound that made the ground tremble beneath our feet. "Cave in," Hammond shouted as rocks began to fall from above. We ran as fast as we could, but by the time the dust settled, we were separated by a wall of rubble. I could hear Hammond shouting on the other side, but his voice sounded muffled and far away. "Stay where you are," he yelled. "I'll find another way around." I wanted to believe him. I really did, but as I stood there alone in the darkness, with only my headlamp for company, I couldn't shake the feeling that something was watching me from just beyond its beam. Standing there alone in the dark, I felt my heart pounding in my chest. The air was so still, so heavy, it felt like the mine was alive, breathing around me. I kept my headlamp on the rubble pile where Hammond had been, hoping to hear him digging his way back through. But after a few minutes, the only sound was the faint drip of water echoing through the tunnels. I didn't want to move. Every instinct told me to stay put and wait for Hammond. But then I heard something, his voice. "Diane, over here." It was distant but clear, coming from deeper inside the mine. Relief washed over me. He must have found another way around. "I'm coming," I called back, my voice trembling as I started down the tunnel. The path twisted and turned unpredictably, and the deeper I went, the stranger things became. The walls were covered in markings, scratches and symbols that looked almost deliberate, like someone had carved them into the rock with purpose. My headlamp flickered as I moved, casting strange shadows that danced along the walls. "Diane." Hammond's voice called again, louder this time. It sounded close, too close. I quickened my pace, turning a corner into a larger chamber. That's when I saw it, a figure moving in the shadows at the edge of my light. My breath caught in my throat as I froze in place. "Hammond," I whispered, stepping closer. The figure darted out of sight with inhuman speed, disappearing into one of the side tunnels before I could get a good look at it. My headlamp flickered again, and for a moment, everything went dark. When the light came back on, I saw something that made my stomach drop. A journal lying on the ground near an old rusted pickaxe. It looked ancient, its leather cover cracked and worn with age. I picked it up carefully and flipped through its brittle pages. The handwriting was shaky but readable. It belonged to one of the miners from 1907, the year of the collapse. "They're not men anymore," one entry read. "The darkness changed them, twisted them into something else." My hands started to shake as I read more. "They can hear us, see us, even when we can't see them. They mimic our voices to lure us deeper." I slammed the journal shut and stuffed it into my bag, my mind racing with fear and disbelief. Was this some kind of sick joke, or had those miners really changed? Before I could think any further, Hammond's voice called out again, this time from multiple directions at once. "Diane, over here. Diane, this way. Help me." The voices overlapped and echoed through the tunnels, growing louder and more frantic with each passing second. My chest tightened as panic set in. "No," I whispered to myself, backing away from the sound. "This isn't real." But then something moved behind me, a pale, elongated figure that darted past so quickly I barely had time to register it. Its skin was translucent, almost glowing in the dim light of my headlamp, and its movements were unnervingly smooth. I turned and ran without thinking, my footsteps echoing wildly as I tried to put as much distance as possible between me and whatever that thing was. The whispers followed me, growing louder and more insistent. "Diane, Diane." I didn't stop until I reached another chamber, a dead end with no way forward or back without retracing my steps. My headlamp flickered again as I pressed myself against the wall trying to catch my breath. That's when I realized whatever those things were, they weren't just watching me anymore. They were hunting me. I stood there, pressed against the cold rock wall, trying to keep my breathing quiet. My headlamp flickered again, and for a terrifying moment I was plunged into total darkness. When the light came back on, I scanned the chamber, my hands trembling as I gripped the flashlight. The whispers had stopped. The silence was worse. I forced myself to move, inching along the wall toward a narrow opening at the far end of the chamber. It was barely wide enough for me to squeeze through, but staying here wasn't an option. My heart pounded as I crawled through the tight space, every scrape of my boots against the rock echoing like a gunshot. When I emerged on the other side, I found myself in a massive cavern. The air was damp and heavy, and my headlamp barely lit the edges of the space. But what caught my attention wasn't the size of the cavern. It was what was inside it. Bones. Dozens of them scattered across the floor in piles. Some were old and brittle, yellowed with age. Others looked disturbingly fresh. My stomach turned as I realized some of them still had scraps of clothing attached. Modern climbing gear mixed with tattered remnants of old mining uniforms. I stepped closer, my boots crunching on loose gravel. That's when I saw it. The remains of one of the missing climbers. His body was slumped against the wall, his face frozen in an expression of pure terror. His hands were clutching something, a small recording device. With shaking hands, I picked up the recorder and pressed play. The audio crackled to life, filled with static and faint breathing. "They're everywhere," a man's voice whispered, barely audible over the noise. "We thought we could outclimb them, but they're faster than us, smarter than us." There was a long pause, followed by a sound that made my blood run cold. A voice calling out in perfect mimicry, "Help me, over here." The recording ended abruptly with a scream and a loud crash. I dropped the recorder and stumbled back, my mind racing. This couldn't be real. It couldn't be happening. But as I looked around at the piles of bones and scattered gear, I knew there was no denying it anymore. The miners from 1907 hadn't just disappeared, they'd changed into something else. Something that had been living down here ever since. And now they had me trapped. Before I could think about what to do next, I heard movement behind me, a soft scraping sound like nails on stone. Slowly I turned around and saw them. At first there were only 2 or 3 pale figures with translucent skin that glowed faintly in the darkness. Their eyes were sunken hollows, and their movements were unnervingly smooth, almost graceful. They moved as one, their heads tilting in unison as if studying me. Then more appeared from the shadows, 5, 10, maybe more than 20. They surrounded me silently, their heads twitching slightly as they listened to every sound I made. I didn't dare move or breathe too loudly. My mind raced for a way out, but there was none, not with them blocking every possible exit. Then one of them opened its mouth and spoke. "Diane?" It wasn't just my name, it was Hammond's voice coming from its lips. Perfectly mimicked, down to every inflection and tone. "Help me," another one said in a voice that sounded like Lewis's, the helicopter pilot who wasn't even here. They weren't just hunting me, they were playing with me. I didn't know what to do. My legs felt frozen, my mind racing as the creatures closed in. Their movements were slow, deliberate, like they knew I had nowhere to go. Every time one of them spoke, it sent chills down my spine. The voices were too perfect, too human. "Diane, over here," one of them whispered. Mimicking Hammond's voice again, I clenched my fists, trying to keep myself from panicking. I needed to think. I needed to move. But the fear was overwhelming. My chest felt tight, and the walls of the cavern seemed to press closer around me. Then I remembered something, the emergency flares in my bag. They weren't much, but they were bright and loud enough to maybe buy me some time. With trembling hands, I reached into my pack and pulled one out. The creatures stopped moving as soon as they saw it, their heads tilted sharply, their hollow eyes fixed on the flare like they knew what it could do. "Stay back," I said, my voice shaking as I struck the flare against the rock wall. It ignited with a blinding burst of red light, casting sharp shadows across the cavern. The creatures recoiled instantly, hissing and retreating into the darkness like they couldn't stand the brightness. I didn't wait to see what they'd do next. I ran. My boots pounded against the rocky floor as I sprinted toward one of the tunnels that wasn't blocked by rubble or creatures. The flare burned hot in my hand, lighting the way ahead and keeping them at bay for now. The tunnel twisted and turned unpredictably, and every time I thought I was getting closer to an exit, it seemed to lead me deeper into the mine. My headlamp flickered again, forcing me to rely on the flare's light to guide me. Behind me, I could hear them, soft scraping sounds that echoed through the tunnels like claws on stone. They weren't running. They didn't need to. They were following me patiently, waiting for their moment. I stumbled into another chamber, a smaller one this time, and spotted something that gave me a glimmer of hope. A ventilation shaft high up on the wall. It was old and rusted, but big enough for me to crawl through if I could reach it. The problem was getting there. The shaft was at least 10 feet off the ground with no obvious way to climb up. My heart sank as I realized how exposed I was. If the creatures caught up to me here, there'd be nowhere to hide. I scanned the room frantically and spotted an old wooden crate near one of the walls. It looked sturdy enough to stand on, but as I moved toward it, I heard them again, closer this time. Diane. The voice came from right behind me. I spun around and saw one of them standing in the entrance to the chamber, its pale skin glowing faintly in the dim light of my dying flare. It tilted its head again, studying me like a predator sizing up its prey. Without thinking, I grabbed another flare from my bag and lit it. The creature hissed and retreated slightly, but didn't leave entirely. It was learning now, waiting for me to make a mistake. I dragged the crate under the ventilation shaft as quickly as I could and climbed onto it, my hands scrambling for a grip on the rusty edges of the opening above. The metal groaned under my weight, but held steady enough for me to pull myself inside. As soon as I was halfway through, I heard them rushing toward me, their movements suddenly faster and more frantic than before. I kicked at them desperately, using my boots to keep them from grabbing hold of me as I crawled deeper into the shaft. The flare burned out just as I pulled myself fully inside, plunging everything back into darkness. But even in the pitch blackness of the shaft, I could still hear them scraping against the walls below me, climbing after me. The ventilation shaft was narrow and cramped, barely wide enough for me to crawl through. Every movement sent echoes bouncing off the metal walls, and I could hear them behind me, scraping, clawing, getting closer. My hands were shaking as I pulled myself forward, my knees scraping against the rough surface. Diane. The voice came again, this time from somewhere ahead of me. It sounded like Hammond, but I knew better now. They were playing tricks, trying to lure me deeper into the mine. I clenched my teeth and kept moving, refusing to stop or look back. The shaft twisted and turned unpredictably, and the air grew colder with every inch I crawled. My headlamp flickered again, casting eerie shadows that danced along the walls. Exhaustion was setting in. I could feel it in my arms and legs, but I couldn't afford to slow down. Then I heard another voice. Lewis's this time. Diane. It's me. I found you. It sounded so real, so convincing, that for a moment I almost believed it. But when I stopped to listen more closely, I realized something was off. The voice wasn't coming from ahead of me, it was coming from my own radio. I froze, staring at the device clipped to my vest as static crackled through the speaker. Diane. Diane. Over here. I yanked the radio off my vest and threw it down the shaft behind me, the sound of it clattering against the walls echoing loudly. But even without the radio, their voices didn't stop. Help me. This way. You're going the wrong way. They were everywhere now, surrounding me with overlapping whispers that made it impossible to think straight. My head throbbed as their voices grew louder and more desperate, each one perfectly mimicking someone I knew. Then they started saying things they shouldn't know. Remember Denver, one of them whispered in a voice that sounded like my former police partner. You froze up, you let him die. No, I muttered under my breath, shaking my head as I crawled faster. It's not real. But they didn't stop. You're not cut out for this, another voice said, this one sounding like one of the other rangers who doubted me from the start. You're just a scared little girl pretending to be brave. Tears stung my eyes as their words dug deeper into my mind, pulling at memories I'd tried so hard to bury. The shooting in Denver, the nightmare, the constant need to prove myself, it all came rushing back in an overwhelming wave. I stopped crawling and pressed my forehead against the cold metal wall of the shaft, trying to block out their voices, but they were inside my head now, twisting reality until I couldn't tell what was real anymore. Diane. Hammond's voice called again, soft and pleading this time. It's okay. You can trust me. I closed my eyes tightly, trying to focus on anything but their words. My breathing was shallow, my heart pounding like a drum in my chest. Then something touched my ankle. I screamed and kicked wildly, scrambling forward as fast as I could without looking back. The shaft opened up into another chamber, a small one with a single ladder leading upward toward what looked like daylight. I didn't think, I just ran for it. The ladder was old and rusted, but it was my only way out. I grabbed the rungs and started climbing as fast as I could, ignoring the sharp pain in my hands as the rough metal bit into my skin. Below me I could hear them, scraping, climbing, getting closer. Diane. Their voices echoed up the shaft, overlapping and growing louder. They sounded so human, so familiar, but I knew better now. These weren't people. They were something else, something that had been down here for far too long. I climbed faster, my legs burning with effort. The faint glow of daylight above me was like a lifeline pulling me forward. But just as I reached the halfway point, the ladder shook violently. I looked down and saw one of them, a pale, elongated figure clinging to the rungs below me. Its hollow eyes stared up at me, unblinking as its long fingers gripped the metal with unnatural strength. "Help me," it said in Hammond's voice, its lips twisting into a grotesque imitation of a smile. "No," I screamed, kicking at it with all my strength. My boot connected with its face, and it let out a hiss before losing its grip and falling back into the darkness. But there were more of them. I could hear their claws on the walls, their whispers growing louder as they closed in. My headlamp flickered again, and for a terrifying moment, everything went dark. When the light came back on, I saw something that made my blood run cold. Hammond. He was clinging to the ladder just below me, his face pale and streaked with dirt. "Diane," he said weakly. "It's me. Please don't leave me." I froze, my mind racing. Was it really him, or was it another one of them? His voice sounded real, his eyes filled with desperation, but after everything I'd seen and heard down here, I couldn't trust anything anymore. "I can't," I stammered, tears streaming down my face as I kept climbing. "Diane," he shouted, his voice breaking, "don't leave me." I didn't look back. I couldn't. My survival instincts took over as I climbed faster than I thought possible, my hands slipping on the rusted rungs but refusing to let go. The top of the ladder led to another tunnel, a narrow passage that sloped upward toward what looked like an exit. But before I could reach it, the ground shook violently beneath my feet. They were coming for me, all of them. Desperation took over as I spotted something nearby, an old crate filled with sticks of dynamite left behind by the miners. It was risky, insanely risky, but it was my only chance to stop them. I grabbed a stick and lit it with one of my flares, my hands trembling as I set it near the base of the tunnel where they'd have to pass through to reach me. Then I ran, sprinting up the slope toward the faint glow of daylight ahead. Behind me, I heard the dynamite explode, a deafening roar that shook the entire mine and sent a cloud of dust and debris rushing toward me like a tidal wave. The force knocked me off my feet and sent me tumbling forward into blinding sunlight. I landed hard on rocky ground outside the mine entrance, coughing and gasping for air as the dust settled around me. For a moment, everything was silent. No whispers, no scraping sounds, just the sound of my own ragged breathing. I'd made it out, but as I lay there staring up at the sky, something caught my attention. A faint sound carried on the wind. "Diane." It was distant but unmistakable, the same voice that had haunted me in the tunnels below. I don't know how long I lay there on the rocky ground, staring up at the sky. The sun was so bright it hurt my eyes, but I couldn't bring myself to look away. I was alive. Somehow, I'd made it out. The mine entrance behind me was completely sealed now, buried under tons of rock and debris from the explosion. Whatever those things were, they were trapped down there. At least, that's what I told myself. Eventually, a search and rescue team found me. They said I was lucky to be alive, that the mine could have collapsed completely with me still inside. I didn't tell them what had really happened. I couldn't. Who would believe me? In the hospital, they asked me questions about the missing climbers, about Hammond, but I didn't have any answers that made sense. Hammond was gone, the climbers were gone, and the mining company wasted no time using the incident as an excuse to demolish and seal off all the old tunnels for good. For a while, I thought that would be the end of it. I went back to work as a ranger, but I stayed far away from Devil's Peak. Instead, I focused on high alpine regions where the air was clear and open, and there were no dark places to get lost in. But even now, months later, I can't shake the feeling that it's not over. Last week, I was patrolling near a tourist cave attraction miles away from Devil's Peak when I saw something that stopped me in my tracks: strange rock formations near the cave entrance. They looked just like the ones I'd seen before, back at the mines. And then there was the sound, a faint whisper carried on the wind.
Diane.
I froze, my heart pounding as I looked around, but there was no one there. Just tourists laughing and chatting say explored the trails. But when I checked my radio later that day, I heard it again, faint but unmistakable. Help me, over here. I don't know how far those things can travel or how many of them might still be out there. But one thing is certain, they're not finished with me yet. My name is Frank Holloway. I'm a park ranger stationed at Whispering Pines, a remote outpost deep in the Sierra Nevada mountains. Most people wouldn't want this kind of job, isolated, lonely, and far from civilization. But for me, it's exactly what I needed. After my wife passed away 3 years ago, I couldn't bear being around people anymore. The memories were too much, so I asked for this transfer, hoping the quiet would help me heal. Mornings here are peaceful. I usually start my day with a hot cup of coffee on the porch of the ranger station. The air is crisp and cold, and the only sounds are the wind rustling through the pines and the occasional chirp of birds. Sometimes, if I'm lucky, I'll spot deer grazing in the clearing just beyond the trees. It's moments like these that remind me why I came here, to escape and find some kind of peace. That morning felt like any other. The sun was just starting to rise, casting long shadows across the forest floor. As I sipped my coffee, I heard the crackle of my radio inside. I stepped back into the station and turned up the volume. "This is a weather alert for Sierra Nevada regions," the voice crackled. "Unusual weather patterns expected to move in over the next few days. Heavy snow and possible electromagnetic disturbances reported." Electromagnetic disturbances, that was a new one. I didn't think much of it at the time. Strange weather wasn't uncommon up here in the mountains. Later that morning, Mac Williams stopped by. Mac's a local hunter who's been living in these woods longer than anyone else. He's gruff and doesn't talk much unless he has something important to say. "Morning, Mac." I greeted him as he stepped onto the porch. "Frank." He nodded, his rifle slung over his shoulder. He took a moment to glance around before speaking again. "You seen anything strange out here lately?" "Strange how?" I asked. He scratched his beard and looked toward the trees. "Tracks. Big ones. Bigger than any bear or mountain lion I've ever seen." I raised an eyebrow. "You sure they weren't just distorted by snow or something?" Mac shook his head firmly. "Nah, these were different. Too clean, too deliberate." He paused for a moment before waving it off like it didn't matter. "Probably nothing," he muttered before heading back down the trail. I watched him disappear into the woods, feeling a small twinge of unease in my chest, but I told myself it was nothing to worry about. Later that afternoon, while patrolling near the edge of the forest, I noticed something odd on one of the trees, a strange fungus growing on its bark. It glowed faintly, almost like it was giving off its own light. I leaned in closer to get a better look and saw that it wasn't just on one tree, it was spreading to others nearby. I made a mental note to report it later but didn't think much of it at the time. Fungi were common in damp forests like this one, though I'd never seen anything quite like this before. As evening fell and shadows stretched longer across the forest floor, I couldn't shake an odd feeling creeping over me, a sense that something wasn't quite right. But for now, everything seemed calm enough. The next morning started off quiet, but something about the air felt off. It was colder than usual, and the forest seemed unnaturally still. No birds chirping, no rustling leaves, just silence. I told myself it was probably just the weather shift the radio had mentioned yesterday, but deep down I couldn't shake the feeling that something wasn't right. Around mid-morning, I got a call on my radio from one of the nearby logging camps. Normally, I don't have much to do with them. They keep to their work and I keep to mine, but the voice on the other end sounded concerned. "Ranger Holloway, this is Camp 3. We've got some equipment acting up over here. Chainsaws stopping for no reason, trucks stalling out. Could you come take a look?" "Sure thing," I replied, grabbing my coat and heading out. The camp wasn't far, maybe a 20-minute hike through the woods, but as I got closer I noticed something strange. The trail leading to the camp was littered with broken branches and patches of disturbed snow, like something big had moved through recently. I stopped for a moment to examine the ground and saw faint tracks, long and narrow, like a person's footprints, but stretched out somehow. Too big to be human. I felt a chill run down my spine but kept moving. When I finally reached the camp, it was eerily quiet. No engines running, no voices calling out, just silence. "Hello?" I called out, stepping into the clearing where their equipment was parked. Nothing. The place looked abandoned. Half-eaten meals sat on picnic tables, steam still rising from coffee mugs as if they'd been left behind just minutes ago. Trucks and machinery were still running, engines humming softly, but there wasn't a single person in sight. I walked around the camp, calling out again. "Anyone here?" Still nothing. That's when I noticed a small notebook lying on one of the tables. It looked like someone had been writing in it recently. The ink was still wet on the last page. Flipping through it, I found entries written by one of the loggers. Most of it was routine stuff, notes about their work schedule and equipment repairs. But the last few entries were different. "Something's watching us. We keep hearing noises at night. Branches, snapping, whispers in the wind. Saw something between the trees today, tall and thin, almost human but not quite." I closed the notebook and looked around nervously. The wind picked up slightly, rustling the trees around me. For a split second, I thought I saw movement out of the corner of my eye, a shadow slipping between two trees, but when I turned to look directly at it, there was nothing there. I decided to head back to my station and report this to my supervisor over the radio. But as I started walking back through the forest, my radio began acting up, static crackling loudly in my ear before cutting out completely. Then came something else. Faint whispering sounds mixed in with the static. It didn't sound like words, more like murmurs or voices too far away to understand, but it sent shivers down my spine. I stopped walking and turned in a slow circle, scanning the trees around me. The forest felt bigger somehow, darker and more menacing than it had just an hour ago. That's when I heard it, a low growl coming from somewhere behind me. I froze. It wasn't like any animal sound I'd ever heard before, not a bear or mountain lion or anything else that should have been out here. It sounded almost unnatural. I didn't wait to find out what it was. Gripping my flashlight tightly in one hand and my radio in the other, I started walking faster, then jogging, until I finally broke into a full sprint back toward my station. By the time I reached safety and slammed the door shut behind me, my heart was pounding so hard it felt like it might burst out of my chest. I leaned against the door for a moment to catch my breath before turning on every light in the station. The warm glow helped calm me down a little, but that uneasy feeling still lingered in the back of my mind. Something wasn't right out there in those woods, and whatever it wasn't going away anytime soon. The next day, I couldn't stop thinking about what had happened at the logging camp. Where had everyone gone? What was that growl I'd heard in the woods? And those tracks, they didn't make any sense. I tried to radio my supervisor again, but the static was worse than before. It was like something was interfering with the signal. That's when there was a knock at the door. I nearly jumped out of my skin. I wasn't expecting anyone, especially not this early in the morning. When I opened the door, it was Earl Prescott, a local hunting guide I'd worked with a few times before. Earl was in his late 50s, tough as nails, and not the kind of guy who scared easily. But today he looked shaken. "Frank," he said, his voice low and hurried, "we've got a problem." "What kind of problem?" I asked, stepping aside to let him in. Earl glanced over his shoulder before speaking again. "Mac Williams is missing. His wife said he never came home last night." My stomach sank. Mac wasn't the type to get lost. He knew these woods better than anyone. "That's not all," Earl continued. "I found something out there while looking for him." He reached into his coat pocket and pulled out a small object, a flashlight. It looked old and battered, but what caught my attention was the way it was bent and twisted, like it had been crushed by something incredibly strong. "Found this near some strange tracks," Earl said grimly. "Same kind Mac mentioned to you, right?" I nodded slowly, feeling that same unease creeping back over me. We decided to form a search party. Earl called in 2 state police officers, Jenkins and Daniels, to help us comb through the area where Mac had last been seen. By mid-afternoon, we were deep in the forest, following a trail of those strange footprints. They seemed to appear out of nowhere, emerging from one tree trunk and disappearing into another, like whatever made them had stepped straight through solid wood. "This doesn't make any damn sense," Jenkins muttered as he examined one of the prints. "It's like nothing I've ever seen," Daniels added, shining his flashlight on a nearby tree where deep vertical slashes marked the bark. Earl stayed quiet, gripping his rifle tightly as we moved deeper into the woods. The further we went, the more uneasy I felt. The trees seemed taller here, their branches twisting together overhead to block out most of the sunlight. It felt like we were being watched. We stopped for a rest break near a small clearing. Jenkins wandered off to relieve himself while the rest of us sat down to catch our breath. That's when we heard it. A blood-curdling scream coming from where Jenkins had gone. "Jenkins!" Daniels shouted, jumping to his feet and running toward the sound. Earl and I followed close behind. When we reached the spot, there was no sign of Jenkins, just his flashlight lying on the ground, embedded halfway into a tree trunk as if it had been swallowed by the wood itself. What is this?" Daniels stammered, staring at the flashlight with wide eyes. Earl backed away slowly, his face pale. "I told you something's out here," he muttered under his breath. "Something that ain't natural. We searched for Jenkins for hours but found nothing. No footprints, no blood, no sign of a struggle. It was like he'd vanished into thin air." By nightfall, Daniels insisted we head back to my station to regroup and figure out our next move. Earl agreed reluctantly, though he kept glancing over his shoulder as if expecting something to jump out at us at any moment. But just as we were about to turn back, we stumbled across something else, a cluster of old equipment half buried in the snow. It looked like it had been there for decades. Rusted metal boxes, broken glass vials, and faded papers scattered across the ground. "What is this stuff?" Daniels asked as he picked up one of the papers and squinted at it in the fading light. "Looks like some kind of research equipment," I said, examining one of the metal boxes more closely. "But why would it be all the way out here?" Earl didn't answer. He was staring at something carved into a nearby tree trunk, an old Native American pictograph showing tall figures stepping through trees while smaller human shapes knelt before them in fear. A sudden gust of wind whipped through the clearing, carrying with it a faint whispering sound that sent chills down my spine. "We need to get out of here," Earl said firmly, gripping his rifle tighter than ever. None of us argued. We made it back to the ranger station just as the last light of day disappeared behind the mountains. The forest felt alive, like it was breathing around us. Every snap of a twig or rustle of leaves made my heart race. By the time we slammed the door shut behind us, I was drenched in sweat even though the air outside was freezing. Daniels paced nervously across the room while Earl sat at the table, his rifle resting on his lap. I tried to radio for help again, but all I got was static. Static, and that strange whispering sound that seemed to grow louder every time I turned the dial. "What is that?" Daniels asked, his voice shaking. "It's like voices," I don't know, I admitted, setting the radio down. But whatever it is, it's not normal. Earl let out a bitter laugh. Normal? You think any of this is normal? Jenkins is gone, just gone, and something out there is playing games with us. I didn't have an answer for him. None of this made sense. All I knew was that we were in over our heads. That night, we decided to take shifts keeping watch. Earl volunteered to go first while Daniels and I tried to get some rest, but sleep didn't come easy. Every time I closed my eyes, I saw those strange tracks in the snow or heard Jenkins' scream echoing in my head. At some point during the night, I woke up to find Earl standing by the window, staring out into the darkness. "Earl," I whispered, sitting up. "You see something?" He didn't answer right away. When he finally turned to look at me, his face was pale and his eyes wide with fear. "They're moving," he said quietly. "What's moving?" I asked, getting to my feet. "The trees," he replied, his voice barely above a whisper. "They're shifting." I walked over to the window and looked outside. At first, everything seemed normal. The same dark forest I'd seen 100 times before, but then I noticed it. Subtle movements in the shadows. The trees weren't swaying in the wind. They were bending, almost like they were leaning toward us. A loud crash from outside made both of us jump. Daniels bolted awake, grabbing his flashlight as we all rushed to the door. "Stay back," Earl warned as he opened it slowly and stepped onto the porch. The cold night air hit me like a slap in the face as we followed him outside. The forest was silent again, too silent, but something felt wrong. The air smelled damp and earthy, like freshly turned soil after a rainstorm. Then we saw it, a massive pine tree near the edge of the clearing with something embedded in its trunk. A hand. A human hand sticking out of the bark as if it had grown there. Daniels stumbled back with a gasp, while Earl cursed under his breath. I stepped closer, despite every instinct screaming at me to stay away. The hand was pale and lifeless. Its fingers curled slightly as if frozen mid-grasp. The bark around it looked warped and twisted, almost like it had melted around the flesh. "That's Jenkins," Daniels whispered hoarsely. "That's his hand." Before any of us could say another word, a low creaking sound filled the air, the sound of wood groaning under pressure. The tree with Jenkins' hand began to move, its branches twisting unnaturally as if reaching for us. "Inside, now," Earl shouted, shoving Daniels toward the station. We scrambled back inside and bolted the door behind us. My hands were shaking so badly I could barely lock it. What is happening?" Daniels stammered, sinking into a chair and burying his face in his hands. Earl didn't answer. He just paced back and forth like a caged animal while muttering under his breath about things he'd seen in these woods over the years but never believed until now. I tried to focus on anything that might give us answers. That's when I remembered the old research equipment we'd found earlier that day. Digging through my bag, I pulled out one of the faded papers we'd collected and spread it out on the table. The writing was hard to read, faded and smudged, but one phrase stood out clearly: Bishop Project Evergreen, Accelerated Growth Experiment. "What is this?" Daniels asked, leaning over my shoulder to look at it. "Some kind of government experiment," I said slowly as I scanned the rest of the page. "It says they were testing ways to speed up plant growth, but something went wrong." Earl stopped pacing and leaned over to read too. "What kind of wrong are we talking about?" I pointed to another line further down on the page. The unintended side effects include anomalous behavior in flora, potential sentience observed. "Sentience," Daniels repeated, his voice trembling. "You mean they're alive?" Before I could answer, another loud crash came from outside, this time closer than before. The lights flickered briefly before going out completely, plunging us into darkness. And then we heard it, a faint tapping sound on the windows, followed by whispers coming from all around us. The whispers didn't stop. They grew louder, circling the station like a storm. Daniels sat frozen in his chair, staring at the window as shadows danced across the glass. Earl gripped his rifle tightly, his knuckles white as he backed away from the door. I stood by the table, clutching the research papers like they were some kind of shield. "What do we do?" Daniels whispered, his voice barely audible over the noise outside. I didn't have an answer. My mind was racing, trying to make sense of everything. The glowing fungus, the strange tracks, Jenkins' hand in the tree, and now this, whatever Project Evergreen had unleashed on these woods. Then I remembered something I hadn't thought about in years. My wife, I said quietly, more to myself than anyone else. Earl turned to look at me. What about her? I swallowed hard and took a deep breath. Her ashes, I scattered them in these woods. The room went silent for a moment, except for the whispers outside. Daniels frowned. What does that have to do with, it feeds on grief? I interrupted, my voice shaking. That's what the papers say. It's drawn to people who've suffered loss. Earl narrowed his eyes at me. You're saying this thing, whatever it is, came after us because of you? No, I said quickly. It's not just me. Jenkins lost his brother last year. He told me about it once when we were patrolling together. And Mac's son died in a hunting accident years ago. Daniels stared at me in disbelief. You think it's targeting people who've suffered? I nodded slowly. It's not just random. Earl let out a bitter laugh and shook his head. Great. So we're all screwed because we've got baggage. Before I could respond, the whispers outside changed. They weren't just murmurs anymore. They were words now, clear and deliberate. Frank. I froze. Frank, the voice repeated, soft and familiar. My heart stopped as I recognized it. It was her voice. My wife's voice. No, I whispered, shaking my head. That's not possible. The shadows outside shifted again, and for a moment, I thought I saw her face. Her beautiful face, staring back at me through the window. Frank, she said again, her voice filled with warmth and sadness. Come outside. Earl grabbed my arm before I could move. Don't, he warned. It's not her. I wanted to believe him. I wanted to believe this was just another trick, but the sound of her voice was so real, so familiar, that it tore at my heart. She's gone, Earl said firmly, pulling me back toward the table. Whatever this thing is, it knows how to mess with your head. I closed my eyes and tried to block out her voice, but it was impossible. Memories of her flooded my mind. Her laugh, her smile, the way she used to hum while cooking dinner, and suddenly it all made sense. This thing isn't just feeding on grief, I said quietly. It's using it against us. Daniels looked at me nervously. What do you mean? It knows what hurts us most, I explained. It uses our pain to lure us in. Earl swore under his breath and tightened his grip on his rifle. Well, it ain't getting me. The lights flickered again before going out completely, plunging us into darkness once more. And then we saw it. The fungus. It was growing inside the station now, spreading across the walls and floor like veins pulsing with faint light. The air grew thick and heavy as spores floated around us, making it harder to breathe. Daniel started coughing violently while Earl backed away from the spreading growths. We have to get out of here, Earl said urgently. Now, but before we could move, something slammed against the door, a loud thud that shook the entire building. Frank. Her voice called again from outside. I clenched my fists and forced myself to stay put as tears streamed down my face. It's not her, Earl repeated firmly. Don't let it win. The pounding on the door grew louder. Whatever was out there wasn't going to wait much longer. Earl stood by the window, his rifle aimed at the darkness, while Daniel struggled to catch his breath, coughing harder with every second. The spores in the air were getting thicker, clinging to our clothes and making it feel like we were breathing through wet cloth. We can't stay here, Earl said through gritted teeth. This place is a death trap. I knew he was right. The glowing fungus was spreading fast, crawling up the walls and across the ceiling like it was alive. The whispers outside had turned into a low hum, vibrating through the floorboards and making my head pound. Where do we go? Daniels wheezed, his voice barely audible. There's an old fire lookout tower about a mile from here, I said quickly. It's high up and isolated. Maybe we can hold out there. Earl nodded. Then let's move before this thing gets in. We grabbed what little gear we could carry. Flashlights, a flare gun, and a few bottles of water and made our way to the door. Earl went first, throwing it open and stepping onto the porch with his rifle raised. The cold night air hit us like a wall, but it was nothing compared to what we saw waiting for us. The trees were moving, not swaying in the wind but shifting, bending toward us like they were alive. Their branches stretched out like arms, reaching for the station as if trying to pull it into the forest. "Go," Earl shouted, waving us forward. We ran. The path to the lookout tower was narrow and winding, cutting through dense forest that felt darker than it should have been. My flashlight barely pierced the shadows ahead of me, and every step felt like something was watching us from just beyond its beam. Daniels stumbled behind me, coughing so hard I thought he might collapse. I grabbed his arm and pulled him forward as best I could. "Keep moving," Earl called from up ahead. "We're almost there," but then something moved in the trees. A tall, thin figure stepping out from between two trunks like it had walked straight through solid wood. Its bark-like skin glistened in the faint light of our flashlights, and its hollow eyes seemed to glow faintly as it stared at us. "What is that?" Daniels screamed, stumbling backward. "The Strider," I muttered under my breath before grabbing Daniels again. "Run." We sprinted down the trail as fast as we could, dodging low-hanging branches and jumping over fallen logs. Behind us, I could hear the sound of wood creaking and snapping as the Strider followed, its long limbs moving unnaturally fast as it closed the distance between us. Finally, we broke through the tree line and saw the fire lookout tower rising above us, a tall wooden structure with a narrow staircase leading to its cabin at the top. "Go, go," Earl shouted, covering us with his rifle as we climbed the stairs two at a time. When we reached the top, I turned back to see Earl fire a shot at the Strider. The bullet struck its chest but didn't even slow it down. It just kept coming, stepping through trees like they weren't even there. "Earl, come on," I yelled. He fired one more shot before turning and running up the stairs after us. As soon as he reached the top, I slammed the hatch shut behind him and locked it tight. The cabin was small but sturdy, with windows on all sides that gave us a clear view of the forest below. For a moment, everything was quiet except for our heavy breathing. Then we saw them. The trees around the tower were moving again, their branches twisting together to form a dense wall that surrounded us completely. The Strider stood at the base of the tower now, staring up at us with those empty eyes. "What do we do now?" Daniels asked weakly as he slumped against one of the walls. Earl didn't answer. He just loaded another round into his rifle and kept his eyes on the creature below. I looked around desperately for anything that might help us when my flashlight beam landed on an old journal sitting on one of the shelves. Flipping through its pages quickly, I realized it belonged to one of the researchers from Project Evergreen, the same people who had created this nightmare decades ago. One passage caught my eye. "Dazant fire is our only defense against accelerated growth anomalies. Burn everything." "Fire," I said aloud, my mind racing. "That's how we stop it." Earl glanced at me skeptically. "You want to burn down half the forest?" "If that's what it takes," I replied firmly. "It's already spreading. We have to stop it before it gets any worse." Daniels coughed weakly from where he sat. How do we even start a fire big enough?" I pulled out the flare gun from my bag and held it up. "This should do." Earl nodded grimly. "All right then, let's light this place up." The Strider didn't move. It just stood there at the base of the tower, staring up at us with those hollow, glowing eyes. The trees around it were shifting again, their branches twisting together like they were forming some kind of cage around the lookout. The air felt heavy, like it was pressing down on us, and the whispers had returned, low and constant, echoing through the cabin. "We don't have much time," I said, gripping the flare gun tightly in my hand. "If we wait any longer, we're not getting out of here." Earl nodded, his jaw clenched as he checked his rifle one last time. "All right, let's do this." Daniels was barely conscious now, slumped against the wall and coughing weakly. The spores in the air were getting thicker, glowing faintly as they drifted around us like fireflies. I knew he wouldn't make it much longer if we didn't act fast. I opened the hatch and climbed halfway down the stair, aiming the flare gun at the base of the tower where the fungus was spreading across the ground like veins. My hands were shaking so badly I could barely hold it steady. "Come on," I muttered under my breath, taking a deep breath to steady myself. Then I fired. The flare shot out in a burst of bright red light, landing in the middle of the fungal growths and igniting them instantly. Flames spread quickly across the ground, consuming everything in their path, including several trees that began to crack and groan as they burned. The strider let out a sound, a deep, guttural growl that shook the tower and made my ears ring. For the first time it moved, stepping back from the flames as if it was finally afraid. "It's working," Earl shouted from above. "Keep going." I climbed back up to grab another flare while Earl fired his rifle at the creature below. The bullets didn't seem to hurt it, but they kept it distracted long enough for me to load another shot. Just as I aimed again, something slammed into the side of the tower, a massive branch that had twisted itself into a battering ram. The whole structure shook violently, nearly knocking me off my feet. "It's trying to bring us down," Earl yelled. I fired another flare into the forest below, igniting more trees and sending flames roaring through the underbrush. The heat was intense now, making sweat pour down my face as smoke filled the air around us. The strider stepped back further into the shadows but didn't retreat completely. It was still watching us, its glowing eyes flickering like embers in the darkness. Then I saw it, the clearing. Through the smoke and flames, I spotted a massive tree standing alone in a clearing just beyond where we'd started the fight. It was ancient, its trunk wider than any I'd ever seen and covered in glowing fungal growths that pulsed faintly like they were alive. "That's it," I said aloud, pointing toward it. "That's where it's coming from." Earl followed my gaze and nodded grimly. "Looks like we've got one shot at this." We grabbed Daniels, who was barely able to stand, and climbed down from the tower as quickly as we could. The fire was spreading fast now, lighting up the forest with an eerie orange glow that made everything look distorted and unreal. The strider didn't follow us. It stayed near the edge of the flames, watching silently as we ran toward the clearing. But I could feel its presence all around us, the whispers growing louder with every step we took. When we reached the ancient tree, I stopped dead in my tracks. Up close, it was even more horrifying than I'd imagined. Its bark twisted and warped like melted wax, with human shapes embedded in its surface. Faces stared out at us from within the wood, eyes wide with terror and mouths frozen mid-scream. "It's absorbing them," Earl said quietly, his voice filled with disgust. I stepped closer despite every instinct telling me to turn back. Among those faces was one I recognized immediately, my wife's face. "No," I whispered, tears streaming down my cheeks as I reached out toward her image. "It's not real," but her eyes moved. They looked at me, and her lips parted slightly as if she was trying to speak. "Frank," her voice whispered again from somewhere deep within the tree. Earl grabbed my arm and pulled me back sharply. "Don't let it fool you. Oh, it's not her." I clenched my fists and forced myself to look away from her face. This thing wasn't my wife, it wasn't anyone. It was just a monster pretending to be something it wasn't. "Burn it," Earl said firmly. "Now." I raised the flare gun one last time and aimed directly at its base, the heart of whatever this thing was, and fired. The explosion was deafening, a burst of light and heat that sent shockwaves through the clearing and knocked all three of us off our feet. Flames engulfed the ancient tree instantly, consuming its fungal growths and sending black smoke billowing into the sky. The faces embedded in its bark twisted and writhed as if trying to escape before finally disappearing into ash. And then, silence. The whispers stopped. The trees stopped moving. The strider vanished into thin air like smoke blown away by the wind. It was over, or so we thought. The fire raged behind us as we stumbled out of the clearing, coughing and gasping for air. Smoke filled the sky, turning it an eerie shade of orange, and the heat was so intense it felt like it was burning through my skin. Daniels was barely able to walk, leaning heavily on Earl as we made our way back toward the trail. For the first time in days, the forest felt quiet. The whispers were gone and the trees stood still, no longer bending or twisting unnaturally. But the silence wasn't comforting. It was heavy, like the calm after a storm when you're not sure if it's really over. We reached my Ranger vehicle parked near the edge of the forest and loaded Daniels into the back seat. Earl climbed into the passenger side while I slid behind the wheel, my hands trembling as I started the engine. The drive back down the mountain was slow and uneasy. The road twisted through dense woods that still felt wrong somehow, even though everything seemed normal again. Every shadow looked like it might move. Every sound made me jump. I couldn't shake the feeling that something was still watching us. "Do you think it's gone?" Daniels asked weakly from the back seat. Earl didn't answer right away. He stared out the window, his rifle resting across his lap. Finally, he said, "I don't know, but whatever we did back there, it hurt it." I nodded silently, gripping the steering wheel tighter as we continued down the road. When we finally reached town, Daniels was taken to the hospital to recover from his injuries. Earl and I stayed behind to file a report about what had happened. But how do you explain something like this? How do you tell people about a creature that can walk through trees or a forest that seems alive? We didn't mention the Strider or the ancient tree in our report. Instead, we blamed everything on an unexplained fire and left it at that. But deep down, I knew this wasn't over. 2 weeks later, I woke up in a hospital bed with no memory of how I'd gotten there. My arms were covered in bandages, and my skin felt strange, rough, and dry like bark. The doctor said I'd been found unconscious near Whispering Pines with burns on my hands and arms from what they assumed was a forest fire. They didn't know how long I'd been out there or why I'd gone back. I didn't tell them about the dreams, the ones where I saw her face again, calling me back to the woods. I didn't tell them about how my arms sometimes felt like they were growing roots or how I could hear faint whispers when everything else was quiet. When I was discharged from the hospital, I didn't go home. Instead, I disappeared, left town without telling anyone where I was going. Months later, visitors to Whispering Pines began reporting strange sightings in the forest. Tall figures moving between trees and glowing fungal growths returning to areas that had burned during the fire. Some claimed they saw a man standing in a clearing near an old fire lookout tower, watching them silently before disappearing into the shadows. No one knows who he is or where he came from, but I do. My name is Marcus Turner. I'm 35 years old, a park ranger here in the Okefenokee Swamp, Georgia. Before this, I was a Navy guy serving in Vietnam. That was a lifetime ago, but some nights it feels like it was just yesterday. The swamp is where I came to heal, or at least try to. It's quiet out here, peaceful most of the time. The kind of place where you can lose yourself and forget about the things you've seen. This morning started like any other. I was out on my airboat, gliding through the misty waters as the sun came up. The swamp was beautiful, calm and still with only the sound of birds calling in the distance. This place has a way of making me feel like I'm part of something bigger, something ancient. As I steered the boat around a bend, I spotted Emil standing on the bank. He's an old Cajun trapper who's been living out here longer than anyone can remember. He waved me over with his hat. "Morning, Emil," I said, cutting the engine and drifting closer. "Morning, Ranger," he replied, his voice rough like gravel. "You notice how low the water's getting? Swamp's thirsty." I nodded. "Yeah, it's been a dry season." Emil leaned in a little closer, his eyes narrowing like he was about to share some big secret. "When the water gets thin like this, things wake up, hungry things." I smiled politely, but didn't take him too seriously. Emil loved his stories about swamp monsters and spirits. "I'll keep an eye out," I said before starting up my boat again. As I moved deeper into the swamp, I began to notice what he meant about the water levels. Large patches of mud and stone were exposed where there should have been water. In one spot, I saw these strange stone formations sticking up from the ground, circles and lines that didn't look natural at all. Curious, I stopped to take a few photos with my camera. The wildlife seemed normal enough, herons wading through the shallows and gators sunbathing on logs, but something felt off. It was too quiet. Usually there's this constant buzz of life in the swamp, frogs croaking, insects humming. but today it felt like everything was holding its breath. Then I saw them, these weird round depressions in the mud. They were perfectly circular and smooth around the edges, almost like they'd been carved out by hand. Kneeling down for a closer look, I ran my fingers along one of them. It sent a shiver through me, not cold exactly, but unsettling. Suddenly, there was a loud splash behind me. My heart jumped into my throat as I spun around, but all I saw were ripples spreading across the water. Probably just a fish or maybe an alligator slipping under. But still, it didn't sit right with me. I climbed back onto my boat and started up the engine again. As I moved further into the swamp, that uneasy feeling stayed with me, like something was watching me from beneath those dark waters. My name is Marcus Turner, but most folks just call me Turner. I wasn't always a park ranger. Before this, I was in the Navy during Vietnam. I spent most of my time patrolling rivers and swamps over there, places not too different from this one. The jungle was hot and thick, and the water always seemed to hide something dangerous. It's funny how life works. I left one swamp only to end up living in another. The war left its mark on me though. I don't talk about it much, but there are nights when I wake up drenched in sweat, heart pounding like I'm back there again. Sometimes it's the sound of gunfire in my dreams. Other times, it's just the feeling of something moving under the boat. It's hard to explain, but those memories stick with you. After the war, I didn't know what to do with myself. I drank too much, got into trouble here and there. That's when Parker stepped in. He's my boss now, the head ranger at the station. He gave me a job when no one else would, and helped me get back on my feet. Told me I needed something to focus on, something to keep me grounded. He was right. The swamp became my refuge. Out here, it's just you and nature. No noise except for the birds and the wind rustling through the trees. It's peaceful, most of the time. I've spent years learning every inch of this place, how to read the currents, how to spot gator nests from a mile away, even how to predict storms just by watching how the animals behave. The swamp has its own rhythm, its own way of telling you when something's about to change. Lately though, things have felt different. The drought has hit hard this year. Water levels are lower than I've ever seen them. And then there are the stories from some of the older folks around here. They say when the water gets low like this, it stirs up things that should stay buried. I've been collecting those stories for years now. Folklore about spirits in the swamp or creatures that come out at night. Most of it is just old wives' tales meant to scare kids into staying out of trouble. But every now and then you hear something that sticks with you, like Emil's warning this morning about hungry things. I don't believe in monsters or ghosts or any of that stuff. But sometimes, late at night when I'm out here alone, I can't help but wonder. Last night was one of those nights. I was dreaming about Vietnam again. About being on a patrol boat in some dark river, and then suddenly there was this sound, like something huge moving under the water. It felt so real that when I woke up, my hands were shaking. I told myself it was just a dream, just my mind playing tricks on me like it does sometimes. But after what I saw today, the strange stone formations and those perfect circles in the mud, I'm starting to wonder if maybe there's more to this swamp than even I understand. The next day started off like any other. I was back at the ranger station, going through the usual paperwork and radio calls. But then a report came in that caught my attention. A group of university researchers had gone missing. They'd been out here studying the effects of the drought on the swamp's ecosystem. 3 of them, all young and eager, had set up camp a few miles from where I'd been yesterday. They were supposed to check in every evening, but no one had heard from them in 2 days. I volunteered to go check it out. Something about it didn't sit right with me. Researchers don't just vanish. They're usually careful, especially out here where the swamp can be unforgiving if you're not prepared. It didn't take long to find their camp. It was tucked away on a small patch of dry land surrounded by shallow water. At first glance, everything looked normal. Their tents were still standing, and their equipment was scattered around like they'd just stepped away for a moment. But as I got closer, I realized something was wrong. The camp was too quiet. No voices, no sounds of movement, just the wind rustling through the trees. I called out, "Hello? Anyone here?" but got no response. I started looking around. Their gear was all there, backpacks, notebooks, even a half-eaten meal sitting on a tin plate. but there was no sign of the researchers themselves. It was like they'd just vanished into thin air. Then I found their camera. It was one of those fancy ones with a big lens, still set up on a tripod near the edge of the water. The memory card was still inside, so I decided to take a look at what they'd been photographing. Most of the pictures were what you'd expect. Shots of plants, animals, and the swamp itself. But then I came across something that made my stomach tighten. One photo showed strange ripples on the water's surface, long and narrow, like something huge had just passed underneath. Another showed shadows beneath the water that didn't look like fish or gators. They looked like something else entirely. The last photo was blurry, but it sent chills down my spine. It showed what looked like a hand, long and webbed, reaching up from beneath the water. I put the camera down and tried to steady my breathing. Maybe it was just a trick of the light or some kind of prank, but deep down I knew better. That's when I noticed something else. A small recording device sitting on one of their tables. It was still running, its red light blinking steadily. I hit play and listened. At first, all I could hear was water lapping against something solid and the occasional chirp of insects. But then came a sound that didn't belong, a low, deep hum that seemed to vibrate through my chest, even though it was just a recording. It wasn't like anything I'd ever heard before, almost like whale song, but deeper and more haunting. The recording ended abruptly, with what sounded like splashing and muffled screams. I turned off the recorder and stood there for a moment, trying to make sense of what I'd just heard. My hands were shaking again, just like last night after that dream. Before I left the camp, an old fisherman named Earl showed up at the station with something strange in his hands. A translucent scale bigger than my palm. "Caught this near Dead Man's Bend," he said gruffly as he handed it over. "Ain't no fish I've ever seen." I held it up to the light. It shimmered faintly like glass but felt rough to the touch. Whatever it had come from, it wasn't normal. As I headed back to report what I'd found at the camp, that uneasy feeling crept over me again. The same one I'd felt yesterday by those strange stone formations and circles in the mud. Something wasn't right in this swamp, and whatever it wasn't done yet. After reporting what I'd found at the camp, Parker sent Rodriguez to join me. Rodriguez was one of the younger rangers, a good guy, but not as familiar with the swamp as I was. He brought his dog Max along for the search, which I didn't mind. Sometimes animals pick up on things humans miss. We headed back to the researchers' camp to take a closer look. Rodriguez seemed uneasy right from the start. "You sure they didn't just get lost?" he asked, as we walked through the abandoned site. "Maybe," I said, though I didn't believe it. "But if they did, why leave all their gear behind?" Rodriguez nodded, but didn't say anything else. Max sniffed around the edge of the water, his tail wagging lazily at first, but then he stopped suddenly. His ears pinned back and his body stiff. He let out a low growl and backed away from the water, like he wanted nothing to do with it. "What's wrong with him?" Rodriguez asked. I shook my head. Animals know things we don't. We decided to check out a spot mentioned in the researchers' notes, a section of swamp where they'd found underwater caves exposed by the low water levels. It wasn't far from Dead Man's Bend, where Earl had caught that strange scale. As we got closer, Max grew more agitated. He kept pulling on his leash like he wanted to turn back, whining softly every time we moved closer to the water. "Maybe we should listen to him," Rodriguez joked nervously. I didn't laugh. Something about this area felt wrong, like we weren't supposed to be here. The cave system was partially visible now that the water had receded. Jagged openings in the muddy ground led down into darkness, and strange claw marks covered some of the nearby trees, marks too high up for any animal I could think of. Rodriguez crouched near one of the openings and shined his flashlight inside. "Looks deep," he said. "Think they went in there?" "Maybe," I replied, though my gut told me otherwise. As we stood there, the air seemed to grow heavier, like it was pressing down on us. The swamp was quiet again, too quiet, and a thick fog began rolling in out of nowhere. "We should head back," I said finally, my voice sounding steadier than I felt. Rodriguez nodded quickly, and we started making our way back to the boat. But before we could reach it, there was a splash behind us, loud enough to make both of us freeze in place. "What was that?" Rodriguez whispered. I turned slowly, gripping my shotgun tightly. The fog was so thick now that I could barely see a few feet in front of me, but I could hear something moving, slow and deliberate, just beyond our line of sight. Max barked furiously but stayed close to Rodriguez's side, his body trembling like he was ready to bolt at any second. "Let's go," I said firmly, keeping my voice low. We moved quickly, but carefully toward the boat, every sound around us amplified by the fog and our nerves. The splashing grew louder behind us, followed by what sounded like heavy breathing, or maybe it was just the wind playing tricks on us. When we finally reached the boat, Max refused to get on board. He just stood there at the edge of the water, growling at something neither of us could see. "Leave him," Rodriguez said urgently as he climbed into the boat. I hesitated for a moment before grabbing Max's leash and pulling him aboard. He whimpered, but didn't fight me as I started up the engine and pushed us away from shore. As we sped through the foggy swamp, I couldn't shake the feeling that whatever had been watching us back there wasn't finished yet. The fog didn't let up as we moved deeper into the swamp. The airboat's engine hummed steadily, but it wasn't enough to drown out the sounds around us, the occasional splash, the rustling of leaves, and something else, something faint but unsettling. It was like a low hum, almost too deep to hear but strong enough to feel in my chest. Rodriguez sat across from me, his face pale in the dim light of the boat's lantern. Max was curled up at his feet, still trembling. I could tell Rodriguez wanted to say something, but he kept quiet. Maybe he didn't want to admit he was as spooked as I was. We were heading back toward the station when the engine sputtered and died. Just like that, the boat slowed to a stop, drifting in the middle of a large pool of water surrounded by cypress trees. Rodriguez muttered, leaning over to check the engine, probably just clogged with mud. Rodriguez, I said, though my voice didn't sound as confident as I wanted it to. I grabbed a flashlight and leaned over the side of the boat to take a look. That's when I saw it. The water around us was moving. Not like normal ripples or currents, but in a slow, deliberate circle, as if something beneath the surface was stirring. "Rodriguez," I said quietly, not taking my eyes off the water, "get your gun." He didn't ask questions. He just reached for his rifle and stood up slowly. Max started growling again, his ears pinned back as he stared at the water. The circular motion grew stronger, and then we saw it, a pale shape gliding just beneath the surface. It was huge, easily bigger than any gator I'd ever seen. Its skin was translucent, almost glowing in the faint light from our lantern. "What is that?" Rodriguez whispered, his voice barely audible. Before I could answer, there was a loud splash. The boat rocked violently as something hit us from underneath. Rodriguez lost his balance and fell backward, dropping his rifle onto the deck. "Hold on," I shouted as I grabbed my shotgun and aimed at the water. But before I could fire, something shot out of the water, a long arm with webbed fingers, and wrapped around Rodriguez's ankle. He screamed as it yanked him toward the edge of the boat. Max barked furiously, lunging at whatever had grabbed him, but it didn't let go. I fired into the water without thinking. The blast echoed through the swamp, and for a moment everything went still. Then Rodriguez scrambled back onto the deck, panting and clutching his leg. His pants were torn where that thing had grabbed him, and there were strange marks on his skin, round sucker-like wounds that oozed blood. "You okay?" I asked, kneeling beside him. He nodded shakily but didn't say anything. His face was pale, and sweat dripped down his forehead despite the cool night air. The water around us was calm again. Too calm, but I knew better than to think we were safe. "The engine," Rodriguez said suddenly. "Get it started." I nodded and moved quickly to check it. My hands were shaking as I worked to clear out whatever had clogged it up. Every second felt like an eternity as I kept glancing over my shoulder at the water. Finally, after what felt like hours but was probably only minutes, the engine roared back to life. I didn't waste any time. I pushed us forward as fast as we could go. Rodriguez sat slumped against the side of the boat, clutching his leg while Max stayed close by his side. None of us spoke as we sped through the foggy swamp, but in my gut I knew this wasn't over. Not by a long shot. The engine roared as we pushed through the fog, but it didn't feel fast enough. My hands gripped the controls so tight my knuckles turned white. Every splash, every ripple in the water made my heart race. I kept glancing over my shoulder, half expecting that thing to come after us again. Rodriguez wasn't looking good. He was slumped against the side of the boat, sweating and breathing hard. Max stayed close to him, whining softly like he knew something was wrong. "You okay?" I asked, though I already knew the answer. "It burns," Rodriguez muttered, wincing as he touched his leg. The sucker marks where that thing had grabbed him were swelling up, turning an angry red. "Feels like it's spreading." I didn't know what to say. I'd seen plenty of gator bites and snake wounds in my time, but this was different. Whatever had grabbed him wasn't just strong, it had left something behind. "We'll get you back to the station," I said, trying to sound calm even though my stomach was in knots. "Parker will know what to do." Rodriguez nodded weakly but didn't say anything else. The fog around us seemed to thicken, swallowing up the trees and turning everything into a gray blur. It was like the swamp itself didn't want us to leave. I tried to stay focused on the path ahead, but nothing looked familiar anymore. Landmarks I knew, like the back of my hand, seemed to have shifted or disappeared entirely. "We're lost," Rodriguez said after a while, his voice barely above a whisper. "No, we're not," I lied. But deep down I wasn't so sure. The swamp had a way of playing tricks on you, especially at night. Then the water started rising. At first I thought it was just my imagination, but as we moved forward, it became clear the water level was going up fast. Areas that had been dry just hours ago were now submerged again, and the current was pulling us deeper into the swamp instead of toward safety. "This doesn't make sense," I muttered under my breath. The drought had drained these waters for months. There was no way they could fill up this quickly. Rodriguez stirred beside me, his eyes glassy with fever. "It's hurting us," he said suddenly. "What?" I asked, glancing at him. "The water, it's pushing us somewhere," he said, his voice trembling. "It doesn't want us to leave." I didn't know what he meant, or maybe I didn't want to understand, but his words sent a chill down my spine. The boat jerked suddenly as it hit something solid beneath the water. I killed the engine and grabbed a flashlight, shining it over the side. What I saw made my blood run cold. We'd run aground on a small island, one that hadn't been there before. The ground was covered in strange stone formations like the ones I'd seen earlier, circles and lines carved into the earth, as if by some ancient hand. "We need to go," Rodriguez said weakly, trying to sit up. "I know," I replied, but my voice sounded hollow even to me. Before I could restart the engine, Max let out a low growl and stood up stiffly, staring into the fog. His hackles were raised, and his teeth bared as he growled louder and louder. "What is it?" I asked quietly, though I already knew we weren't alone. The fog shifted slightly, revealing movement in the water around us, ripples spreading outward, as if something large was circling our boat again. "Turner," Rodriguez whispered, his voice filled with fear. I raised my shotgun and aimed at the water's edge, my finger hovering over the trigger. But nothing happened. No splash, no attack, just that eerie silence broken only by Max's growling and Rodriguez's labored breathing. Then came the sound, a deep hum that seemed to vibrate through my chest like before, but louder this time. It wasn't just a sound, it felt alive somehow, like it was coming from everywhere at once. "We need to move," I said firmly, as I restarted the engine and pushed us off the island as fast as I could. The boat surged forward through the rising water, but no matter how far we went or how fast we moved, that feeling of being watched never left us. And somewhere in the back of my mind, I couldn't shake Rodriguez's words asterisk. It doesn't want us to leave. The water kept rising, pulling us deeper into the swamp. It didn't matter how fast I pushed the boat, or how hard I tried to steer us back toward the station. Something was guiding us away, herding us like cattle. Rodriguez was getting worse. His skin was pale now, almost gray, and the marks on his leg had spread up toward his knee. He kept mumbling under his breath, words I couldn't make out. "Hang in there," I told him, though I wasn't sure he could hear me anymore. Max stayed close to him, whining softly as if he knew something bad was happening. Then we saw it, the island. It rose out of the water like a ghost, covered in thick moss and surrounded by jagged rocks. It wasn't on any map I'd ever seen, and I'd spent years exploring this swamp. But there it was, sitting in the middle of the water like it had been waiting for us. The boat drifted to a stop near the shore, and for a moment, everything was silent. Even Max stopped whining. The only sound was the faint hum that seemed to come from the island itself. "We shouldn't be here," Rodriguez whispered suddenly, his voice weak but clear. I didn't argue with him. Every instinct I had told me to turn around and leave, but something about the island pulled me in. It felt ancient, like it had been here long before the swamp itself. I stepped off the boat carefully, shotgun in hand. The ground was soft and damp beneath my boots, covered in strange stone formations like the ones I'd seen earlier. Circles and lines carved into the earth, stretched out in every direction, some of them glowing faintly in the foggy light. Rodriguez tried to follow me but stumbled as he climbed out of the boat. Max barked sharply as if warning him to stay put, but Rodriguez ignored him and limped forward. "Look at this," I said quietly as I crouched near one of the carvings. It wasn't just random shapes, it was a pattern, almost like writing, but it didn't look like any language I'd ever seen. Rodriguez didn't respond. He was staring at something further up the island, a cluster of stone ruins half buried in moss and mud. They looked like they'd been here for centuries, maybe longer. We moved closer together, stepping carefully over the uneven ground. The ruins were covered in strange markings, paintings of figures standing in circles around tall shapes rising out of the water. Some of them looked human, but others didn't. "What is this place?" Rodriguez asked weakly. "I don't know," I replied honestly. Near one of the walls we found something that made my stomach churn, a pile of old equipment scattered across the ground. Rusted metal tanks, broken cameras, and notebooks so worn they were barely readable. But one thing stood out, a badge with a government seal on it. "This isn't just folklore," I said quietly as I picked up one of the notebooks. "Someone's been here before." The notebook was filled with sketches, drawings of creatures with webbed hands and translucent skin rising out of dark waters. There were notes too, frantic scribbles about prehistoric amphibious life and unexplained phenomena tied to drought cycles. Rodriguez leaned against one of the walls for support, his breathing shallow now. "They knew," he muttered. "They knew what's out here." Before I could respond, we heard it again. The hum, but this time it was louder, closer. I turned quickly, shotgun raised as Max barked furiously at something moving in the water near the shore. Shapes began emerging from beneath the surface, tall figures with pale skin that shimmered faintly in the foggy light. Their eyes glowed faintly like lanterns in the dark, and their movements were slow but deliberate. Rodriguez gasped as he collapsed to his knees beside me. "They're real," he whispered hoarsely. I didn't have time to process what he said before one of them stepped onto land, a humanoid figure with long limbs and webbed hands dripping with water. Its translucent skin revealed veins and organs pulsing beneath its surface like some kind of living machine. Max lunged at it but stopped short as another figure emerged behind it, larger than any human could be, and let out a sound that froze me in place, a deep rumbling hum that seemed to shake the ground itself. "We need to go," I said firmly as I grabbed Rodriguez's arm and pulled him toward the boat. But deep down I knew it wasn't going to let us leave, not without a fight. "Rodriguez, we have to move," I shouted, pulling him up as best I could. His body felt limp like he barely had the strength to stand. Max barked wildly, his teeth bared as he stood between us and the creatures. The first one stepped closer, its webbed feet sinking into the soft ground. Its head tilted slightly, almost like it was studying us. The others stayed in the water, their glowing eyes fixed on us. My heart pounded so hard I thought it might burst out of my chest. I raised my shotgun, aiming at the one closest to us. "Stay back," I yelled, though I doubted it understood me. It didn't stop. I fired. The blast echoed across the swamp, and the creature staggered back with a strange guttural sound. But it didn't fall. Instead, it straightened up again, water dripping from its translucent skin where the pellets had torn through. It looked more annoyed than hurt. Turner. Rodriguez croaked weakly. They're not like us. I didn't have time to think about what he meant, because another one was moving toward us now, faster this time. I fired again, aiming for its head. This time it dropped to the ground with a sickening thud, its glowing eyes fading as it lay still. They can die, I muttered under my breath. But there were more of them, too many. They were coming out of the water now, their movements slow but deliberate as they surrounded us. Rodriguez collapsed onto the ground beside me, his breathing shallow and ragged. His skin was changing, turning pale and almost translucent like theirs. The marks on his leg had spread up to his thigh now, pulsing faintly like something alive was growing inside him. "Turner," he whispered, his voice barely audible. I don't feel right." I knelt beside him, my shotgun still clutched tightly in one hand. "Stay with me," I said firmly. "We're getting out of here." He shook his head weakly. "You don't understand, it's in me." Before I could respond, one of the creatures lunged at us. Max jumped in front of it without hesitation, snarling and snapping at its legs. The creature let out a horrible screech as it swatted at him with one of its long arms. "Max," I shouted as I fired again, hitting the creature square in the chest. It fell backward into the water with a splash, but Max didn't stop barking. His focus was on something else now. The others were closing in fast. I grabbed Rodriguez under his arms and started dragging him back toward the boat. He was heavier than he looked, or maybe I was just running on fumes at this point, but I wasn't going to leave him behind. "Go," he said weakly, his head lolling to one side. "You have to go, not without you," I snapped, as I hauled him onto the boat with Max jumping in right after us. The creatures didn't stop. They were climbing onto the island now, their glowing eyes locked on us as they moved closer and closer. Then I remembered the fuel tanks. The boat had a small reserve tank we used for emergencies. It wasn't much, but it might be enough to buy us some time. "Hold on," I said as I grabbed one of the tanks and unscrewed the cap. The smell of gasoline filled the air as I poured it onto the ground around us. The creatures hesitated for a moment, their heads tilting slightly as if trying to figure out what I was doing. I pulled a flare from my pack and struck it against the side of the boat. The bright red light flared to life in my hand as I held it up for a moment before tossing it onto the fuel-soaked ground. The fire roared to life instantly, spreading out in a circle around us. The creatures screeched and backed away from the flames, their glowing eyes flickering like dying embers. But it wasn't over yet, not by a long shot. The fire gave us a moment of breathing room, but it wouldn't last long. The creatures circled just outside the flames, their glowing eyes flickering in the light. They didn't seem scared, just cautious, like they were waiting for the fire to die down, or for us to make a mistake. Rodriguez was lying on the floor of the boat now, barely conscious. His skin was almost see-through and I could see the veins beneath it pulsing faintly. Whatever was happening to him, it wasn't stopping. "Turner," he whispered, his voice so weak I had to lean in close to hear him. "You have to leave me." "Not a chance," I said firmly, though my voice cracked as I spoke. He grabbed my arm with surprising strength, his fingers cold and clammy. "It's inside me," he said, his eyes wide with fear. "I can feel it changing me." I shook my head, refusing to believe it. "You're gonna be fine," I lied. "We're getting out of here." But deep down I knew he was right. The marks on his leg had spread up his body now, and his eyes were starting to glow faintly like theirs. Whatever these things were, they'd infected him somehow. Before I could say anything else, one of the creatures lunged through the flames. It moved faster than I expected, its long arms reaching out toward the boat. Max barked furiously and leapt at it, sinking his teeth into its arm. "Max!" I shouted as I raised my shotgun and fired point blank at the creature's head. The blast sent it sprawling backward into the water, but Max didn't stop barking. He stood at the edge of the boat, growling at the others as they began testing the flames again. They were learning. I grabbed another fuel tank and poured it around the edge of the boat, creating a barrier between us and them. But we couldn't stay here forever. The fire wouldn't hold them off for long, and Rodriguez didn't have much time left. "Turner," he said again, his voice barely audible now. You know what you have to do. I shook my head again, refusing to even consider it. No, I said firmly. We're both getting out of here. But then he did something that broke my heart. He smiled. It was faint and sad, but it was a smile all the same. You're a good man, he said softly before his body convulsed violently. I stepped back in shock as his skin began to ripple and shift beneath the surface. His fingers elongated into webbed claws, and his eyes glowed brighter as he let out a low growl that didn't sound human anymore. Rodriguez, I whispered, my voice trembling. He looked at me for one brief moment, just long enough for me to see that he wasn't Rodriguez anymore, and then he lunged. I didn't have time to think. I raised my shotgun and fired. The blast knocked him backward into the water, where he disappeared beneath the surface without a sound. For a moment, everything went still again. The fire crackled around me, and Max whimpered softly at my feet, as if he understood what had just happened. But then the others moved in. They came all at once this time, dozens of them emerging from the water like shadows come to life. Their glowing eyes burned through the smoke as they closed in on us from every direction. I grabbed the last fuel tank and threw it into the center of the island before pulling out another flare. This is for Rodriguez, I muttered under my breath as I struck the flare against the side of the boat and tossed it onto the fuel tank. The explosion was deafening, a blinding flash of light followed by a wave of heat that knocked me off my feet. The creatures screamed as fire engulfed them, their bodies writhing in agony before collapsing into ash. When the smoke cleared, there was nothing left but silence, and me lying on the floor of the boat with Max curled up beside me. We'd survived for now. When I woke up, the sun was just starting to rise. The fog had lifted, and the swamp looked almost peaceful again. Almost. My body ached all over, and my head was pounding. Max was lying next to me, his fur singed in places but otherwise unharmed. He licked my hand when I stirred, his tail wagging weakly. The boat was still floating, though it was charred and battered from the explosion. The island was gone, just a smoldering patch of water where it had been. Whatever those things were, they were gone too, at least for now. I sat up slowly, trying to piece together what had happened. Rodriguez's face flashed in my mind, his smile, his final words, and my chest tightened. I'd lost him. I'd lost a good man out there, and no one would ever believe what really happened. By the time I made it back to the ranger station, Parker was waiting for me. His face went pale when he saw the state I was in, covered in mud and blood, with burns on my arms and a haunted look in my eyes. What the hell happened out there? He asked as he helped me off the boat. I didn't know how to answer him. How do you explain something like this? How do you tell someone about creatures that shouldn't exist, or an island that disappeared into thin air? They didn't make it, I said finally, my voice hollow. The researchers, Rodriguez, they're all gone. Parker didn't push me for details. Maybe he could see that I wasn't ready to talk about it, or maybe he just didn't want to know. They sent me home after that, said I needed time to recover, but I knew what they really meant. They thought I'd cracked under the pressure, that the swamp had gotten to me like it had gotten to so many others before me. I didn't argue, let them think what they wanted. The truth was worse than anything they could imagine. Weeks passed, but the memories didn't fade. Every time I closed my eyes, I saw Rodriguez's face, or those glowing eyes staring at me from beneath the water. The swamp wasn't just a place anymore. It had become something alive in my mind, something that would never let me go. One night, as I sat on my porch with Max lying at my feet, I saw a news report on TV. 5 people had gone missing in the Okefenokee swamp, another group of researchers studying the effects of the drought. My stomach turned as I watched the footage of their abandoned camp, so similar to the one I'd found weeks ago. The reporter talked about how dangerous the swamp could be during droughts, how easy it was for people to get lost out there. But I knew better. I reached for my shotgun and loaded it slowly. Max lifted his head and looked at me with those big brown eyes of his, as if asking if we were really going back out there. I don't have a choice, I said quietly as something heavy moved across my porch, a shadow too large to belong to any animal I knew. The swamp wasn't done with me yet. My name is James Redfeather. I'm a ranger stationed in the boundary waters of Minnesota, where the winters bite harder than anywhere else I've ever known. I'm 38 years old, half Ojibwe and half white, and I've spent my life walking a line between two worlds. Some people respect me for my survival skills, but others look at me like I'm some kind of outsider because of the old ways I still follow. Out here, though, it doesn't matter what people think. When the snow falls and the cold comes for you, you either know how to survive or you don't. It was late November when the first blizzard hit. The kind of storm that makes you feel like the world's been swallowed whole by ice and darkness. I was preparing my cabin, checking the woodpile and patching up the windows when Wilson showed up. He was new to the station, a skinny guy from Arizona who'd never seen snow before. He looked at me like I was crazy when he saw me hanging small charms near the door. "What's that supposed to be?" Wilson asked, his voice sharp with skepticism. "Just something my grandmother gave me," I said, keeping it vague. He didn't need to know it was medicine meant to ward off bad spirits. Wilson already thought I was superstitious nonsense wrapped in ranger gear. The radio crackled as we sat down for coffee. The voice on the other end warned us that supply routes were being cut off earlier than expected. The snow was piling up fast, and soon we'd be completely isolated out here. Wilson didn't seem worried. He joked about how he'd brought enough canned beans to last him a lifetime, but I could feel something heavy in the air. Something wasn't right. Later that evening, my grandmother visited me at the cabin. She's an elder in our community and knows things most people have forgotten or chosen not to believe. She didn't stay long. She just handed me a pouch filled with cedar and sage and said, "Hunger walks early this year." Her words sent a chill down my spine, even though the fire was roaring in the stove. The animals were acting strange too. Deer were wandering closer to human settlements than they ever should, their eyes wide with fear. The wolves, usually loud and restless, had gone completely silent. It felt like the forest itself was holding its breath. I tried not to think too much about it as I settled in for the night, but as I drifted off to sleep, I couldn't shake the feeling that something was watching me from out there in the dark. I woke up the next morning to the sound of Wilson cursing. He was trying to start the snowmobile, but it wouldn't even sputter. The cold had sunk its teeth into everything overnight, freezing the fuel lines solid. I walked outside, pulling my coat tight against the wind, and saw him kicking at the machine like it owed him money. "Welcome to Minnesota," I said, trying not to smile. "You'll learn." Wilson shot me a look. "I don't know how you deal with this every year." I shrugged. "You get used to it," but the truth was, you never really got used to it. You just learned how to live with it. As I helped him with the snowmobile, my mind wandered back to my childhood. My father was white, my mother Ojibwe, and I grew up straddling two worlds that didn't always fit together neatly. I spent summers learning traditional ways from my grandmother, how to track animals, how to read the weather, how to protect yourself from things you couldn't see. But winters were different. Winters meant school, where I sat in classrooms being taught by people who didn't understand me or my family. They called our traditions superstitions and told us we needed to leave them behind if we wanted to succeed. I never did leave them behind. The old ways kept me alive out here more times than I could count. Back in the cabin, I kept a notebook filled with stories I'd collected from elders over the years. Most of them were about survival, how to find food when there's nothing but snow and ice, how to stay warm when the cold feels like it's clawing at your skin, but some were darker. Stories about spirits that walked in winter, hunting for those who were weak or desperate. The Wendigo was one of those stories. I'd heard about it since I was a kid, a spirit that fed on hunger and turned people into monsters. It started with a craving you couldn't satisfy, no matter how much you ate. Then came the cold that wouldn't leave your bones, no matter how many fires you lit. And finally you changed, your body twisted into something unnatural, something that lived only to feed. I didn't believe in it when I was younger. But now I wasn't so sure. Wilson interrupted my thoughts with his usual skepticism. "You really believe all that stuff?" he asked as he warmed his hands by the stove. "Doesn't matter what I believe," I said calmly. "What matters is knowing what's out there." He laughed like he thought I was joking, but there was something uneasy in his eyes. Maybe he could feel it too. The way the air seemed heavier than usual, the way the shadows outside stretched just a little too long. That night, I dreamed of snow. Endless snow stretching out in every direction, swallowing everything in sight. In the dream, I was running from something with frozen eyes and a heart made of ice, and no matter how fast I moved, it was always just behind me. When I woke up, my cabin felt colder than it should have been. The next day started like any other. The cold was biting, the snow was deep, and the wind howled like it was alive. Wilson and I were going through our usual morning routine when the radio crackled to life. It was a weak signal, barely cutting through the static, but we could make out enough to understand. A family of trappers had been found dead in their cabin about 10 miles north of us. The voice on the other end said they'd frozen to death, which didn't make sense. Their stove had been fully stocked with wood and their food supplies were untouched. The details didn't add up. Wilson frowned as he listened. How do you freeze to death with a full stove and plenty of food? I didn't answer right away. My gut told me something was wrong. Something worse than just bad luck or poor planning. We should check it out, I said finally. Wilson wasn't thrilled about the idea, but he didn't argue. By mid-morning, we were bundled up and heading out into the snow on snowshoes. The hike was brutal. The wind cut through our coats like knives, and the snow was so thick it felt like walking through quicksand. But we pushed on. When we reached the cabin, I knew right away something was off. The door was wide open, swinging on its hinges, even though the wind should have buried it in snow by now. Inside, it was eerily quiet. No creaking wood, no sound of animals scurrying away. Just silence. The family was huddled together near the stove, a man, a woman, and 2 kids. All frozen solid, their faces twisted in fear. The stove itself was cold, but the wood inside hadn't burned down completely. It looked like they'd stopped using it halfway through the night. Wilson muttered a curse under his breath as he looked around. What the hell happened here? I didn't answer him because my eyes had caught something outside, a set of footprints leading away from the cabin. They were long and narrow like a person's, but stretched out unnaturally, as if whoever made them had feet twice as big as they should have been. They walked out into this. Wilson asked when I pointed them out. Doesn't look like they had a choice, I said quietly. We followed the tracks for a short distance before they disappeared into the trees. There was no sign of anyone or anything out there, but I couldn't shake the feeling that we were being watched. When we got back to our own cabin that evening, I tried to tell Wilson what I thought might be happening, that this wasn't just some freak accident or bad weather, but he cut me off before I could finish. Don't start with that Wendigo stuff, he said sharply. This is just, I don't know what it is, but it's not that. I let it go for now. There was no point arguing with him when he'd already made up his mind. But deep down, I knew this wasn't over. That night, as I lay in bed staring at the ceiling, I heard something outside, a faint scratching sound on the roof, like claws dragging across wood. It stopped after a few seconds, but by then my heart was pounding so hard I thought it might burst out of my chest. I didn't sleep much after that. The storm hit hard the next day. By noon, the snow was coming down so thick it felt like we were trapped inside a snow globe. The wind howled like a living thing, rattling the windows and shaking the cabin walls. Wilson tried the radio, but all we got was static. We were completely cut off. Guess it's just us now, Wilson said with a nervous laugh, but I could see the unease in his eyes. I spent most of the day checking our supplies. The food was fine, and we had enough firewood to last a couple of weeks if we were careful. But something didn't sit right with me. The air inside the cabin felt heavy, like it was pressing down on my chest. I couldn't explain it, but I'd learned to trust my instincts out here. They'd kept me alive more times than I could count. That night, things got worse. It started with Wilson complaining about being hungry. At first, I didn't think much of it. We'd both been eating less to make our supplies last longer, but as the hours passed, his hunger turned into something else. He ate everything he could get his hands on, crackers, jerky, even a can of cold beans he didn't bother heating up. But no matter how much he ate, he kept saying he was starving. You ever feel like you can't get full? He asked me around midnight, his voice shaky. No, I said carefully. You're probably just stressed. He nodded, but I could tell he didn't believe me. The next morning, I woke up to find some of our supplies spoiled. A sack of flour had gone moldy overnight, and a jar of preserves had shattered for no apparent reason. It didn't make sense. Everything had been fine the day before, but I didn't have time to dwell on it because Wilson was acting stranger than ever. He sat by the stove all morning, staring into the flames like they held some kind of secret. His face looked pale and gaunt, and his hands trembled as he held them out to warm them. "You okay?" I asked him. "Just cold," he muttered without looking at me. I knew that wasn't true. The cabin was warm, too warm, even, but Wilson was shivering like he'd been left out in the snow all night. And then there were his eyes. They looked hollow somehow, like something inside him had started to fade away. That evening, as we sat in silence by the fire, I heard it again, the scratching sound on the roof. This time it was louder, more deliberate, like whatever was making it wanted us to know it was there. Wilson didn't seem to notice at first, but when the sound moved from the roof to the walls, slowly circling the cabin, he jumped up from his chair. "What is that?" he whispered. I didn't answer right away. Instead, I grabbed my rifle and moved toward the door. Whatever was out there wasn't an animal. I knew that much, but I wasn't sure what else it could be. When I opened the door, there was nothing but snow and darkness waiting for me. The wind whipped past my face as I stepped outside, scanning the tree line for any sign of movement. But there was nothing, no tracks in the snow, no shadows shifting in the woods, just silence. I went back inside and locked the door behind me. Wilson was still standing by the fire, his hands clenched into fists. "It's just the wind," I lied, but we both knew that wasn't true. The next morning, Wilson wasn't himself. He looked worse. His face was pale, his cheeks sunken, and his eyes had this wild, almost desperate look to them. He wouldn't stop pacing the cabin, muttering to himself under his breath. Every now and then, he'd glance at me like I was a stranger, or worse, like I was something he didn't trust. "I can't stop feeling hungry," he said suddenly, breaking the silence. His voice was hoarse, like he'd been screaming in his sleep. "No matter how much I eat, it's not enough." I tried to stay calm. "You're probably just stressed out. It happens when you're stuck in a place like this." "No," he snapped, his voice sharp and angry. "This is different. It's like there's a hole inside me, and it's getting bigger." I didn't know what to say to that. Instead, I watched as he grabbed a piece of frozen meat from the supplies and started gnawing on it, raw and icy, straight out of the bag. When I tried to stop him, he shoved me back with more strength than I thought he had. "Leave me alone," he growled, his voice low and guttural. That was when I noticed something else. His teeth. They looked sharper somehow, like they'd grown overnight, and his fingers. They seemed longer than they should have been, the nails cracked and jagged. I backed away slowly, trying not to let him see the fear in my eyes. "Wilson," I said carefully, "you need to rest. Let me help you." He didn't answer. Instead, he turned back to the fire and crouched down in front of it like an animal trying to warm itself. His shoulders were hunched, and his breathing was heavy and uneven. That night, things got even worse. I woke up to the sound of something crashing in the main room of the cabin. When I got up to check, I found Wilson standing by the stove with a broken chair in his hands. He'd torn it apart with his bare hands, splinters of wood scattered everywhere, and was staring at me with a look that made my blood run cold. "You don't understand," he said, his voice trembling with rage and fear. "It's inside me." "What's inside you?" I asked quietly. "The hunger," he whispered. "It's not normal. It's alive." I didn't know what to do. Part of me wanted to grab my rifle and lock him outside before things got any worse, but another part of me couldn't bring myself to do it. He was still Wilson, or at least part of him was, and I couldn't just abandon him. But then he did something that changed everything. He picked up the metal fire poker from beside the stove and bent it in half like it was made of soft clay. His hands were shaking as he did it, but the strength it took was impossible, inhuman. That was when I realized what was happening. I'd heard the stories all my life but never thought I'd see it with my own eyes. The Wendigo wasn't just a legend, it was real. and it had taken hold of Wilson. I didn't sleep that night. How could I? Wilson was sitting by the fire, rocking back and forth, muttering to himself in a language I didn't recognize. His voice was low and gravelly, like it didn't belong to him anymore. Every now and then he'd glance at me with those hollow eyes, and I'd feel a chill that had nothing to do with the cold outside. I knew what I had to do, but the thought of it made my stomach turn. The elders had told me stories about the Wendigo, how it starts with hunger, then takes over your body, twisting you into something monstrous. Once it gets hold of you, there's no coming back. The only way to stop it is to kill it before it fully transforms. But this wasn't some story around a campfire. This was real. And Wilson wasn't just some monster. He was a man I'd been working alongside for weeks. A man who'd laughed at my jokes and shared his coffee with me on cold mornings. How could I just end him? Still, I couldn't ignore what was happening. If I didn't act soon, he would turn completely. And when that happened, well, I didn't want to think about what he might do. I waited until he finally drifted off to sleep, or at least something close to sleep. His breathing was shallow and uneven, and his body twitched like he was fighting something in his dreams. Quietly, I grabbed the pouch of medicine my grandmother had given me, the cedar and sage, and sprinkled some around the cabin. Then I lit a small bundle of it and let the smoke fill the room. The smell was sharp and earthy, and for a moment, Wilson seemed calmer. But then he woke up. His eyes snapped open and he let out a sound that wasn't human. A deep guttural growl that made every hair on my body stand on end. He lunged at me before I could react, knocking me to the ground with more strength than any man should have. "You think you can stop this?" he snarled, his voice barely recognizable. "It's too late." I struggled against him, but he was too strong. His hands were like iron clamps around my wrists, pinning me down as his face twisted into something unnatural. His teeth were longer now, sharper, and his skin looked stretched and pale, like it didn't quite fit anymore. Desperate, I reached for the pouch of medicine and threw it into the fire. The flames roared up instantly, filling the room with thick smoke that smelled of cedar and sage. Wilson screamed, a horrible piercing sound that echoed through the cabin, and stumbled back, clutching his head. I scrambled to my feet and grabbed my rifle. My hands were shaking so badly I could barely aim it at him. "Wilson," I said, my voice trembling, "you have to fight this." But he just laughed, a cold, hollow laugh that sent shivers down my spine. "You don't get it," he said through gritted teeth. "It's not me anymore." Before I could say anything else, he turned and ran out into the storm. The cabin door slammed shut behind Wilson, leaving me alone in the sudden suffocating silence. For a moment, I just stood there, staring at the door, my breath coming in short, sharp gasps. My hands were still trembling, and my heart was pounding so hard it felt like it might burst out of my chest. But I couldn't just stay there. Wilson, or whatever he was becoming, was out in the storm now. And if the stories were true, he wouldn't stop until he found something or someone to feed on. I grabbed my coat, my rifle, and a small pouch of cedar and sage. My grandmother's words echoed in my mind. "That hunger walks early this year." I didn't know if I could stop him, but I had to try. If I didn't, more people would die. The storm was brutal. The wind howled like a living thing, tearing at my coat and stinging my face with ice. The snow was so thick, I could barely see a few feet ahead of me, but I followed the tracks Wilson had left behind. They were deep and strange, longer than a man's footprints should be, with claw-like impressions where his toes should have been. I kept moving, one step at a time, my rifle clutched tightly in my hands. The forest around me felt wrong, too quiet, too still. Even the wind seemed to die down as I went deeper into the trees. It was like the world itself was holding its breath. Then I saw it, a trail of blood leading through the snow. My stomach turned as I followed it to a deer carcass lying in the clearing. Its body was untouched except for one thing: its heart had been ripped out. I knelt down next to it, trying to steady my breathing. This wasn't just hunger, this was something else entirely, something darker. As I stood up, I heard a sound behind me, a faint whisper carried on the wind. It sounded like a child's voice, soft and pleading. "Help me," it said. I froze. The voice came again, closer this time. Please, help me. Every instinct in my body told me to run, but I forced myself to stay calm. Wilson, I called out into the storm. The voice didn't answer. Instead, there was laughter, low and cold and cruel, and then silence. I gripped my rifle tighter and kept moving. The tracks led deeper into the woods, twisting and turning like Wilson, or whatever he'd become, was trying to confuse me. But I knew these woods better than most people ever could. This was my home, and no amount of snow or darkness could change that. Finally, I saw it, a faint glow in the distance. As I got closer, I realized it was another cabin, barely visible through the storm. Smoke rose from its chimney, and light flickered through its windows. My heart sank as I realized what this meant. There were people inside. I moved as quickly as I could without making too much noise, circling around the cabin to get a better look. Through one of the windows I saw them, a family of 4 huddled together near the fire, a man, a woman, and 2 kids who couldn't have been older than 10. And then I saw him, Wilson, or what was left of him. He was crouched outside the cabin, his body twisted and grotesque in the dim light. His skin was pale and stretched tight over his bones, his fingers long and clawed. His eyes glowed faintly in the darkness as he stared through the window at the family inside. I raised my rifle and aimed at him. But before I could pull the trigger, he turned his head toward me. "You're too late," he whispered. And then he disappeared into the storm. I stood frozen for a moment, staring into the storm where Wilson had vanished. My breath came out in short, shaky clouds, and my fingers gripped the rifle so tightly it hurt. He was faster than I expected, smarter too, but I couldn't let him get to that family. If he did, there'd be no saving them. I moved quickly toward the cabin, keeping low and quiet. When I reached the door, I knocked hard, 3 times. The sound echoed through the storm, and for a moment, there was no response. Then I heard movement inside, footsteps, whispers, and finally, a man's voice. "Who's there?" he called out, his tone sharp with fear. "My name's James Redfeather," I said, keeping my voice steady. "I'm a ranger. You need to let me in. Now." There was a long pause before the door creaked open just enough for me to see the man's face. He looked tired and scared, his eyes darting nervously past me into the darkness. "What's going on?" he asked. "Why are you out here?" "There's something dangerous in these woods," I said firmly. "You need to barricade your doors and stay away from the windows." The man hesitated but finally nodded and let me inside. The cabin was small and cramped, with a single room that served as kitchen, living area, and bedroom all at once. The woman was sitting by the fire with their 2 kids, holding them close. They all looked up at me with wide, frightened eyes. "What kind of danger?" the woman asked quietly. I hesitated, unsure how much to tell them. "There's an animal out there," I said finally. "It's not safe." The man frowned but didn't press me for details. Instead, he started piling furniture against the door while I checked the windows for any weak points. The storm outside howled louder than ever, shaking the walls of the cabin and making it feel like we were trapped inside a fragile box. And then we heard it, a scratching sound on the roof. The kids whimpered as their mother pulled them closer. The man grabbed a fire poker from beside the stove and held it like a weapon, his knuckles white with tension. "It's here," I whispered. The scratching moved from the roof to the walls, circling the cabin just like it had done at my place. It was testing us, looking for a way in. My heart pounded as I loaded my rifle and motioned for everyone to stay quiet, but then came the voice. "Let me in," it said softly, a perfect imitation of a child's voice. "Please. I'm so cold." The kids started crying, and their mother shushed them desperately, her own face pale with fear. "It's not real," I said quickly. "Don't listen to it." The voice came again, louder this time. "Help me, please." And then there was laughter, low and guttural and wrong. The window nearest to us shattered suddenly, spraying glass across the room. The thing that used to be Wilson reached through with one clawed hand, its fingers impossibly long and thin. Its face appeared next, a twisted mockery of what it once was, with glowing eyes and teeth too sharp for any human mouth. The man swung the fire poker at it, but Wilson, or whatever he'd become, grabbed it with one hand and bent it like it was nothing more than a twig. He let out a horrible growl as he tried to pull himself through the window. It fired my rifle without thinking. The shot echoed through the cabin as Wilson let out an ear-piercing scream and fell back into the snow outside. "Stay here," I told them firmly before stepping outside into the storm. Wilson was waiting for me. His body had changed even more now. His arms were longer, his legs bent at unnatural angles, and his skin had taken on an icy blue tint that made him look like something carved out of frost and shadow. "You can't stop this," he snarled, his voice echoing strangely in the cold air. "It's already too late." I didn't answer him. Instead, I reached into my pocket and pulled out my grandmother's pouch of cedar and sage. As he lunged at me, I threw it into his face and lit another bundle of it with my lighter. The smoke billowed around us as Wilson screamed again, this time in pain, and stumbled back. But he wasn't done yet. He lunged again with impossible speed, knocking me to the ground and sending my rifle skidding across the snow. His claws raked across my arm as I struggled to push him off me, but he was too strong. Desperate, I grabbed a handful of snow and shoved it into his face while chanting one of the prayers my grandmother had taught me under my breath. The words came out shaky and uncertain. I didn't even know if I was saying them right, but they seemed to have an effect. Wilson froze for a moment, his glowing eyes flickering like dying embers. Then he let out one final scream before collapsing into the snow beside me. I lay there for what felt like forever, gasping for breath as the storm raged around me. When I finally got up, Wilson's body was gone, nothing left but a patch of melted snow where he'd fallen. I stood there in the snow, staring at the spot where Wilson had vanished. The storm was still raging, but the wind felt quieter now, like it had lost some of its fury. My arm throbbed where his claws had cut me, and my breath came out in shaky clouds as I tried to process what had just happened. The cabin door creaked open behind me, and the man stepped out cautiously, holding the bent fire poker in one hand. "Is it gone?" he asked. I nodded slowly. For now, he didn't ask me any more questions. Maybe he could see the exhaustion on my face, or maybe he just didn't want to know the answers. Either way, he helped me back inside, where his wife was still holding their kids close by the fire. "Thank you," she said softly, her voice trembling. "You saved us." I didn't respond right away. My mind was still racing, replaying everything that had happened. The way Wilson had changed, the way he'd laughed like he wasn't human anymore, the way he'd melted into nothing but snow and ice. I'd stopped him, but I hadn't saved him, and I wasn't sure I ever could have. I spent the rest of the night with the family, keeping watch while they tried to sleep. When morning finally came, the storm had eased up enough for us to leave. I led them back to my ranger station through the snow, guiding them step by step until we were safe inside. The radio crackled to life as soon as I turned it on. The voice on the other end was faint but urgent. Reports of strange deaths were coming in from other stations across the region. Families found frozen with food untouched, cabins abandoned with claw marks on the walls. Whatever had happened to Wilson wasn't an isolated incident. I filed my report later that day. Officially, it was labeled a murder-suicide driven by winter isolation, just like I knew it would be. No one wanted to hear about spirits or monsters. They wanted explanations they could understand, so I gave them one. But I couldn't stay after that. The woods felt different now, colder, emptier, and every time I closed my eyes, I saw Wilson's twisted face staring back at me. So I resigned from ranger service and went back to my reservation. Years passed before I set foot in those woods again. By then, I'd started teaching young rangers about winter survival, how to track animals, how to build shelters, how to stay safe when the cold felt like it was closing in around you. And sometimes, when no one else was listening, I'd slip in little lessons about protection, about cedar and sage, and how to keep hunger at bay. Because some stories aren't just stories. Some stories are warnings. My name is William Harker. I'm a ranger stationed on the Olympic Peninsula in Washington. I've been doing this job for over 20 years, and I know these woods, these shores, and this weather like the back of my hand. But lately, things haven't felt right. It started with the fog. Now, fog isn't unusual around here. It's part of life on the coast, but this fog was different. It didn't behave like normal fog. It didn't roll in with the tide or burn off when the sun came up. It just lingered, heavy and still, like it was watching. That morning started like any other. I was out early, checking tide pools and collecting data from the weather instruments near the cliffs. The air was damp and the fog was thicker than usual, clinging to everything like a second skin. I could barely see 10 feet ahead of me. As I made my way back to the station, I ran into Joe, a local fisherman I'd known for years. He was loading up his boat at the dock, his face unusually pale. "Morning, Joe," I called out. He nodded but didn't smile like he usually did. "You seen anything strange out here, Bill?" he asked, his voice low. I frowned. "Strange how?" He hesitated, glancing out at the water where the fog swirled like smoke. "Shapes," he said finally. "In the mist. Big ones." I chuckled nervously, trying to lighten the mood. "Probably just your imagination playing tricks on you." Joe didn't laugh. He just shook his head and muttered something about heading home early. As I walked away, a strange feeling crept over me, like I'd forgotten something important, but couldn't quite put my finger on it. When I got back to my truck, I noticed something odd. A perfect circle of dead grass near where the fog had touched the ground. Everything else around it was green and alive. I crouched down to get a closer look, but there was nothing unusual about the soil or plants, just that eerie circle of death. I brushed it off as some kind of natural phenomenon and headed back to the station, but deep down I couldn't shake the feeling that something wasn't right. I got back to the ranger station just as the fog started creeping closer to the building. It was strange. Usually, the fog stayed near the coastline, but today it seemed to be moving inland, like it had a mind of its own. The station was quiet, as usual. It was just me and Lydia Cooper, a younger ranger who'd been working with me for about a year. She was sharp and eager, but she didn't have the years of experience I did. I figured she'd chalk up anything weird to coincidence or overthinking. "Morning, Harker," Lydia said as I walked in. She was sitting at her desk, going through some paperwork. "You see this fog? It's been hanging around all morning." "Yeah," I said, setting my gear down. "It's strange. Doesn't feel normal." She raised an eyebrow at me. "Fog's fog, isn't it?" I didn't answer right away. Instead, I walked over to the window and stared out at the gray wall of mist pressing up against the glass. "Usually," I said finally. "But this feels different." Lydia shrugged and went back to her work, but I couldn't shake the unease that had settled in my chest. Later that day, I stopped by to see Thomas, an elder from the local Quinault tribe who lived nearby. He'd been a friend of mine for years, and I often went to him when something about the land or weather didn't make sense. Thomas greeted me with a solemn nod when I arrived at his small cabin. He always seemed to know when I had questions before I even asked them. "You've noticed it too," he said quietly, motioning for me to sit down. "The fog?" I asked. He nodded. "It's not natural." I leaned forward in my chair. "What do you mean?" Thomas stared into the fire crackling in his wood stove. "The old stories talk about a mist that's alive, hungry. It takes people, their memories, their faces, everything that makes them who they are." I felt a chill run down my spine. "You think that's what this is?" Thomas didn't answer directly. Instead, he said, "Be careful out there, Harker. The mist doesn't just take, it tricks you first." On my way back to the station, his words echoed in my mind. The fog seemed thicker now, almost alive as it swirled around the trees and crept along the ground. When I got home that evening, I found myself staring at my wife's photo on the mantel. She'd passed away 6 months ago after a long battle with cancer. Losing her had left a hole in my life that nothing could fill. But as I stood there looking at her picture, something strange happened. I realized I couldn't remember what we'd done the night before she died. It was like someone had taken an eraser to that part of my memory. I shook my head and told myself it was just grief messing with me again. But deep down, I wasn't so sure anymore. The next morning, I was jolted awake by the sound of the radio crackling at the ranger station. I'd fallen asleep at my desk, surrounded by maps and weather reports. Lydia's voice came through, tense and hurried. "Harker, we've got a situation," she said. "A family's gone missing, last seen near the coastal lookout." I grabbed my jacket and headed out. The lookout was a popular spot for tourists, but with the fog as thick as it was, I couldn't imagine why anyone would be out there. When I arrived, Lydia was already there, standing next to an abandoned car. The doors were wide open, and personal belongings, a backpack, a child's toy, a purse, were scattered on the ground. It looked like whoever had been here had left in a hurry. "No sign of them," Lydia said as I walked up. "It's like they just disappeared." I crouched down to examine the ground around the car. There were no footprints leading away from it, just more of that strange viscous residue clinging to the trees nearby. It shimmered slightly in the dim light, but when I tried to collect some in a jar, it evaporated almost instantly. "What is this stuff?" Lydia asked, her voice shaky. "I don't know," I admitted, "but it's not normal." As I stood up, I brushed my hand against the car door, and suddenly a flash of something hit me. For a split second, I saw two children playing near the edge of the cliff, their laughter echoing in my ears. But just as quickly as it came, the vision was gone. I stumbled back, my heart racing. Lydia gave me a concerned look. "You okay?" "Yeah," I said quickly though. My hands were trembling. "Let's keep looking." We searched the area for hours but found nothing. No tracks, no signs of struggle, nothing to explain what had happened to that family. By the time we called off the search for the day, the fog had grown even thicker, swallowing up everything around us. Later that evening, we got a call from the Coast Guard. They'd spotted an unusual fog bank off the coast, one that didn't show up on their radar. They couldn't explain it either. As I sat alone in my cabin that night, staring out at the swirling mist beyond my window, I couldn't shake the feeling that we were dealing with something far beyond our understanding, something dangerous. The next day, Lydia and I decided to expand the search area. The missing family wasn't the first strange disappearance in the region. Over the past few weeks, there had been scattered reports of people vanishing near the coast, hikers, campers, even a couple of experienced fishermen. At first, I thought it was just bad luck or accidents. But now I wasn't so sure. We started early, heading deeper into the fog-covered trails near the cliffs. The air was damp and cold, and every sound seemed muffled, like the fog was swallowing it. Lydia walked ahead of me, her flashlight cutting through the haze. "Do you think this is connected to the other disappearances?" she asked. "I don't know," I said honestly. "But it's starting to feel like more than a coincidence." About an hour into our search, we stumbled upon something chilling, an old campsite. The tent was still there, half collapsed and covered in dew. A rusted camping stove sat nearby, along with a few scattered belongings, a jacket, a pair of hiking boots, and a journal. "This must have been from one of the missing hikers," Lydia said, kneeling down to pick up the journal. I flipped through its damp pages. Most of it was mundane, notes about the weather, sketches of birds and plants, but near the end the handwriting grew frantic. The last entry sent a shiver down my spine. Fide isn't just fog, it's alive, it's watching me. I hear voices in it, voices that sound like my own. I closed the journal and handed it back to Lydia. "We should take this back to the station," I said quietly. As we stood there, a sudden wave of nausea hit me. I staggered back, clutching my stomach. "Harker, are you okay?" Lydia asked, her voice filled with concern. Before I could answer, the fog around us thickened unnaturally fast. It wasn't like normal fog. It moved with purpose, swirling and twisting as if it were alive. Lydia stumbled back too, her face pale. "We need to get out of here," I said, grabbing her arm. As we hurried back toward the trailhead, I thought I saw something moving in the mist, a shadowy figure that disappeared as soon as I turned to look at it. My heart pounded in my chest. as we finally broke free of the fog and reached clear air. Back at the station, we started digging through old records and newspaper archives. What we found only made things worse: reports of strange disappearances dating back nearly a century. Every few decades, people would vanish under similar circumstances, always near dense fog banks that seemed to defy explanation. "This isn't new," Lydia said softly, staring at an old black and white photo of a search party standing in front of a wall of fog. "It's been happening for years." I nodded grimly. "And whatever it is, it's getting worse." The fog didn't let up the next day. If anything, it was thicker, heavier, like it was pressing down on the entire forest. Lydia and I decided to head back out, determined to find answers or at least some sign of the missing family. We split up to cover more ground, keeping in constant radio contact. I stayed near the cliffs while Lydia moved inland toward the trail system. The air was eerily still, and every step I took felt like it echoed in the silence. About an hour into my search, I saw them. At first, I thought my eyes were playing tricks on me. Through the swirling mist ahead, I spotted 3 figures standing near the edge of the cliff. As I got closer, I realized they looked familiar. Too familiar. It was the missing family. A man, a woman, and 2 young children. "Hey," I called out, my voice cutting through the silence. "Are you okay? Stay where you are." They turned toward me slowly, their movements stiff and unnatural. Something about them wasn't right. Their faces were pale and blank, like masks, and their eyes didn't look human. They looked hollow. "We're lost," the man said, his voice flat and emotionless. "Can you help us?" The woman stepped forward next, her head tilting slightly to the side. "We can't find our way out of the fog." The children just stood there, silent and still, their small hands clutching each other's. My gut told me to stay back, but something about them pulled at me, something familiar. I took a step closer. "Where have you been? Are you hurt?" As soon as I moved toward them, their faces began to shift. Literally shift. It was like watching smoke curl in a breeze. Their features blurred and twisted until they were no longer human at all. Their bodies dissolved into mist that surged toward me like a living thing. I stumbled back, my heart racing as the fog wrapped around me. It wasn't just cold, it was suffocating, pressing against my skin and filling my lungs with a strange metallic taste. My vision blurred as whispers filled my ears, voices that sounded like my own thoughts but weren't. "William," one of them whispered. "Don't you miss her? Don't you want to see her again?" My wife's face flashed in front of me, her smile, her laugh, but it wasn't real. I knew it wasn't real. I tried to fight it off, but the fog was inside my head now, pulling at my memories like threads unraveling from a sweater. Just when I thought I couldn't take it anymore, I heard Lydia's voice shouting through the radio. "Harker, where are you?" Her voice snapped me back to reality. The fog recoiled slightly as she came running toward me with her flashlight cutting through the mist. "Get back," she yelled, waving her flashlight wildly as if trying to scare off an animal. The fog hesitated for a moment, before retreating into the trees, leaving behind nothing but silence. Lydia grabbed my arm and pulled me back toward the trailhead. "What happened? Are you okay?" I couldn't find the words to explain what I'd just seen, or what had almost happened to me. But one thing was clear. This fog wasn't just weather, it was something else entirely. Back at the ranger station, I couldn't stop shaking. Lydia sat across from me, her face pale, waiting for me to explain what had happened. I didn't know where to start. How could I describe something that felt so impossible? Finally, I said, "I saw them, the missing family." But it wasn't them. Lydia frowned. "What do you mean? They looked real, at first," I said, my voice trembling. "But then they changed. They turned into mist, like the fog itself was pretending to be them." Lydia stared at me for a long moment before speaking. "Harker, are you sure? Maybe it was the stress or the fog playing tricks on you." I shook my head. No, it was real. And it wasn't just them. They were inside my head. They knew things about me, about my wife, things no one else could know. Before Lydia could respond, there was a knock at the door. It was Thomas. He stepped inside, his expression grim, and placed a bundle of old papers and photographs on the table. "You need to see this," he said. The documents were ancient tribal records, some written in Quinault and others translated into English. Thomas pointed to a faded drawing of a swirling cloud with human faces trapped inside it. "This is what you're dealing with," he said quietly. "We call them the Fog Weavers." "Fog Weavers," Lydia repeated. Thomas nodded. "They're not spirits. Not exactly. They're something older. Something that feeds on people's memories and identities. They lure you in by taking the shape of someone you love or trust. Once they have you, they take everything." I felt a cold knot form in my stomach as Thomas continued. "The stories say they've been here for centuries," he said. "They come and go with the fog, leaving behind nothing but empty shells of the people they take." Lydia flipped through the papers, her hands trembling slightly. "This explains the disappearances," she said softly. "But why now? Why so many all at once?" Thomas hesitated before answering. "The balance has been disturbed," he said finally. "The land is angry. Too much has been taken from it." I thought about the logging disputes and land rights battles that had been raging in the area for years. Could that really be connected to this? It sounded far-fetched, but after what I'd seen in the fog, I wasn't ready to dismiss anything. Then Thomas looked directly at me, his eyes dark and serious. "They've already touched you," he said. "What?" I asked, my heart skipping a beat. "You've been forgetting things, haven't you?" he said quietly. "Little gaps in your memory that don't make sense." I opened my mouth to deny it, but stopped myself. He was right. Had been forgetting things. At first, I thought it was just grief or stress, but now I wasn't so sure. Thomas pulled out an old leather pouch and handed it to me. Inside was a small bundle of herbs tied together with twine. "This will help clear your mind temporarily," he said, "but it won't last forever." As I held the bundle in my hands, I felt a strange sense of clarity wash over me, like a fog inside my own head had lifted, and then I saw it. In one of my own logbooks on the desk, there were entries written in my handwriting, entries about finding evidence from previous victims and hiding it away. But I had no memory of writing any of it. I stared at the logbook, my own handwriting staring back at me like a stranger's. The words were clear, precise, and detailed. Notes about finding missing belongings, strange residue near the fog, even descriptions of people I didn't remember meeting. But none of it felt familiar. It was like someone else had used my hand to write them. Lydia leaned over my shoulder, her face pale. "Harker, you don't remember any of this?" I shook my head slowly. "Not a single word." Thomas stood silently by the window, watching the fog creep closer to the station. "This is how they work," he said. "They don't just take your memories, they use you. They turn you into a tool for their purpose." I felt sick to my stomach. "You're saying I've been helping them without even knowing it?" Thomas nodded grimly. "It's possible." Lydia stepped back, her expression shifting from concern to fear. I couldn't blame her. If I couldn't trust my own mind, how could she trust me? For the rest of the day, I kept my distance from Lydia and Thomas, trying to piece together what was happening to me. The gaps in my memory were growing wider, and every time I tried to focus on a specific event or detail, it slipped through my fingers like sand. That evening, as the fog thickened outside, something even worse happened. I was sitting alone in the station's main room when I heard her voice. "William." I froze. It was impossible, but I knew that voice anywhere. He was my wife's. "William," she called again, softer this time. I turned slowly toward the window and saw her standing just outside, her figure barely visible through the swirling mist. She looked exactly as I remembered. A warm smile, her dark hair falling over her shoulders. "Come outside," she said gently. "He've missed you." My heart ached at the sight of her. Every instinct told me it couldn't be real, but the part of me that still grieved for her wanted to believe it. "William," she said again, her voice breaking slightly. "Please." I stood up and took a step toward the door before stopping myself. "No," I whispered under my breath. "You're not real." Her smile faltered for a moment before returning, wider this time, too wide. Her eyes shimmered unnaturally in the dim light. "You don't believe me?" she asked, tilting her head like she was confused. "Don't you love me anymore?" The words hit me like a punch to the gut. My hands trembled as I backed away from the window. "Stay away from me," I said firmly. Her expression darkened, and for a split second, her face seemed to ripple like smoke caught in a breeze. Then she was gone. When Lydia and Thomas returned moments later, they found me sitting on the floor, shaking, drenched in sweat. "They're getting stronger," I said hoarsely. "They're inside my head." Thomas knelt beside me and placed a hand on my shoulder. "We have to act now," he said firmly, "before they take everything from you." The station felt smaller that night, like the walls were closing in. The fog outside was thicker than ever, pressing against the windows like it wanted to seep inside. Every creak of the old building made my heart jump. I couldn't shake the feeling that we were being watched. Thomas sat at the table, spreading out a map of the area. Lydia stood nearby, arms crossed, her face pale but determined. "We need to draw them out," Thomas said, his voice steady. "If they stay scattered in the fog, we'll never be able to stop them." "Draw them out?" Lydia asked. "How? And what do we do when they come?" Thomas pointed to the coastline on the map. "Salt water," he said simply. "It's one of the few things they can't cross easily. If we can force them toward the ocean, we might have a chance to weaken them." "And how do we force them?" I asked, my voice hoarse. Thomas looked at me, his expression grim. "Fire." The plan was dangerous, maybe even suicidal, but it was all we had. We decided to set controlled fires in a ring around a section of the forest near the cliffs, using the flames and smoke to funnel the fog weavers toward the ocean. Once they were close enough, we'd use salt water from the tide pools to drive them back. Lydia and I gathered supplies while Thomas prepared a ritual he said would help protect us from their influence, at least for a little while. As we worked, I couldn't shake the feeling that something was wrong. My memories were slipping faster now, like someone was pulling threads out of my mind while I wasn't looking. I found myself questioning everything, where I'd been, what I'd done, even who I was. At one point, Lydia caught me staring blankly at a pile of firewood. "Harker," she said softly. "You okay?" I blinked and nodded quickly. Yeah, I'm fine," but I wasn't fine. Not even close. By the time we were ready to move out, the fog had completely surrounded the station. It felt alive, writhing and shifting like it was waiting for us to make a mistake. Thomas handed me a small pouch filled with salt and herbs. "Keep this with you," he said firmly. "It won't stop them completely, but it'll slow them down if they get too close." I nodded and slipped it into my pocket. As we stepped outside into the cold, damp air, I couldn't shake the feeling that this might be my last night alive. The forest was eerily quiet as we moved through it, the fog swirling around us like it was alive. Every step felt heavier than the last, like the ground itself didn't want us to go any further. Lydia walked ahead, carrying a canister of fuel for the fire. Thomas followed close behind, his hands steady despite the tension in the air. I brought up the rear, clutching the pouch of salt and herbs he'd given me. The fog seemed thicker around me than the others, like it was singling me out. I could feel it pressing against my skin, whispering in my ears with voices I couldn't quite understand. We reached the clearing near the cliffs and began setting up the fires. The plan was simple: light a ring of flames to drive the fog weavers toward the ocean, where they'd be weakest. But as we worked, I couldn't shake the feeling that something was watching us. "Keep moving," Thomas said sharply, his voice cutting through my thoughts. "Don't stop." I nodded and poured fuel onto a pile of dry branches, my hands trembling slightly as I struck a match. The fire roared to life, casting flickering shadows across the misty landscape. That's when I saw her again. My wife. She stood just beyond the edge of the clearing, her figure barely visible through the fog. Her face was soft and familiar, her smile warm and inviting. "William," she said gently, "come here." I froze, my heart pounding in my chest. It wasn't real. I knew it wasn't real, but seeing her there brought back everything I'd tried to bury: her laugh, her touch, the way she used to hum when she cooked dinner. "William," she said again, stepping closer, "you don't have to fight this. Just let go. Don't listen to it." Thomas shouted from behind me. It's not her, but his voice felt distant, like it was coming from another world. All I could hear was hers. "William," she whispered, her eyes shimmering with tears. "I miss you." I took a step toward her before stopping myself. My hand tightened around the pouch in my pocket as I fought to stay grounded. "No," I said hoarsely, "you're not real." Her smile faltered for a moment before twisting into something unnatural, something wrong. Her face rippled like smoke caught in a breeze, and suddenly she wasn't my wife anymore. She was something else entirely. The fog surged forward, wrapping around me like cold fingers clawing at my skin. My vision blurred as whispers filled my ears, voices that sounded like mine but weren't. "William, don't fight it." I stumbled back toward the fire, clutching the pouch tightly as I threw salt into the flames. The fire roared higher, and for a moment the fog recoiled. Thomas and Lydia were shouting now, their voices blending together in a chaotic blur as they worked to light more fires around the clearing. But then I heard Lydia scream. I turned just in time to see her disappear into the fog, her flashlight falling to the ground with a dull thud. "Lydia," I shouted, running toward where she'd been standing. Thomas grabbed my arm before I could go any further. "It's too late," he said urgently. "We have to finish this." "No," I yelled, trying to pull away from him. "We can't leave her. She's gone," he said firmly, his grip tightening on my arm. "If we don't stop them now, we'll all be gone." I hesitated for a moment, before nodding reluctantly and turning back toward the fire. The fog was closing in fast now, swirling around us like a living thing desperate to snuff out our flames. Thomas began chanting softly under his breath as he threw more herbs into the fire. The flames grew brighter and hotter until they were almost blinding. The fog weavers screamed, a sound that wasn't human but felt like it was tearing through my mind, and began retreating toward the cliffs. The fog screamed as it retreated toward the cliffs, twisting and writhing like it was alive. The fires burned bright, casting long shadows across the clearing, and the salt we scattered seemed to hold the mist at bay. For a moment, I thought we'd won, but then I saw her. Lydia stepped out of the fog, her face pale and blank. She looked unharmed, but something about her wasn't right. Her movements were stiff, unnatural, like a puppet on strings. "Lydia," I called out, running toward her. Thomas grabbed my arm again. "Stop," he shouted. "It's not her." I froze, staring at her as she walked closer. Her eyes met mine, and for a moment, I thought I saw a flicker of recognition, a spark of the Lydia I knew. "Harker," she said softly. "It's me." Thomas threw more herbs into the fire, chanting louder now as the fog surged forward again. The flames roared higher, forcing the mist back toward the edge of the cliff. "William," Lydia said again, her voice trembling. "Please, help me." I hesitated, torn between what I knew and what I felt. If it wasn't her, then what was it? But if there was even a chance she was still alive, "Don't listen to it," Thomas shouted. "They're trying to trick you." I took a step toward her before stopping myself. My mind was racing, my heart pounding in my chest. "Lydia," I said quietly, "if it's really you, tell me something only you would know." She hesitated for a moment before smiling faintly. "You hate coffee," she said softly. "You always drink tea instead." My breath caught in my throat. It was true, I'd never liked coffee, and Lydia had teased me about it more times than I could count. But something about her answer felt off, like it wasn't hers. I clenched my fists and stepped back toward the fire. "You're not her," I said firmly. Her smile faded, and for a split second her face rippled like smoke caught in a breeze. Then she lunged at me. I stumbled back as Thomas threw salt into the air around us. The fog recoiled violently, dragging Lydia's figure back into its depths with an ear-splitting scream. The fires burned hotter and brighter until finally the fog began to dissipate, slowly at first, then all at once. The clearing grew quiet as the mist retreated over the cliffs and vanished into the ocean below. Thomas collapsed to his knees, breathing heavily as he stared at the smoldering flames. "It's done," he said quietly. "For now." I looked around the clearing, searching for any sign of Lydia, but there was nothing. She was gone. The investigation was ruled as environmental exposure by officials who refused to believe anything else. The missing family was never found, nor were any of the other victims from previous disappearances. Thomas left shortly after that night, returning to his people with a solemn promise to keep watch over the land. As for me, I retired from service but stayed in the area as a watchman. I couldn't bring myself to leave, not after everything that had happened. Now I spend my days keeping detailed journals of everything I see and hear, trying to hold on to what's left of my memories before they slip away completely. Sometimes at night, when the fog rolls in thick and heavy outside my coastal home, I swear I can see shapes moving in the mist, shadows that look too familiar to be strangers, and sometimes I hear her voice. "William,